1941. Fall asleep to hilarious history, a ledger of broken pacts and Pacific inflatables, written and narrated in the style of Mark Twain. This book is fact-checked and edited by a human. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Act 1. The Open Tab and the Solitary Flight. Chapter 1. The Infinite Lease of Uncle Sam. It has always been a peculiar characteristic of the American human, when confronted by a neighborhood free-for-all across the water, to pull up a porch chair, whittle a stick with immense concentration, and declare to all within earshot that he has no intention of getting his coat dusty. He will state this with a countenance so solemn it would do credit to a tombstone carver. He will point to the Atlantic Ocean, which is, to be fair, a magnificent piece of damp real estate, and speak of it as though it were an impassable ditch designed by the Creator for the express purpose of keeping the Old World's chronic insanity from infecting the New World's Sunday picnics. By the time the year of our Lord 1941 had arrived, however, this grand posture of isolation was beginning to look remarkably like a fat man trying to hide behind a beanpole. Across the pond, John Bull was standing on his chalk cliffs with his sleeves rolled up, his eye blackened, and his pockets entirely turned inside out. He had been fighting the Continental tailor who specialized in straitjackets, and while John's spirit was as stubborn as a Missouri mule, his cash drawer was as empty as a church collection plate on a Monday morning. The rules of international commerce, as codified by the cautious gentleman in Washington under the name of cash and carry, stated with cold legal precision that if you wished to purchase the instruments of salvation from Uncle Sam's hardware store, you had to lay your money on the barrelhead and carry the goods away in your own wagon. It was an excellent rule for a grocery store in a quiet county, but it was a catastrophic failure when the grocery store's chief customer was currently being besieged by a gang of incendiary lunatics who had already set fire to the bakery next door and were currently tossing brickbats at the front windows. Now, Uncle Sam, as represented by that magnificent cigarette-holder-tilting occupant of the White House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knew perfectly well that if John Bull's establishment went under, the fellows with the straitjackets would soon be looking across the Atlantic with an eye toward expansion. But Franklin was also aware that a large portion of his electorate would rather invite a copperhead snake to breakfast than vote for sending another generation of American boys to die in a European mud hole. The problem, then, was how to give a man a gun to defend your own front gate without appearing to be the sort of unchristian neighbor who charges for the privilege of keeping the common enemy at bay. The solution was a piece of political legerdemain so breathtakingly simple, so beautifully absurd, that it could only have been conceived by a country that invented the patent medicine show and the wooden nutmeg. It was called House Bill 1776, the Lend-Lease Act, though it might more accurately have been titled the Great Continental Tab. To explain this grand maneuver to the average citizen, who was more concerned with the price of hogs and the local baseball standings than the geography of the English Channel, the president resorted to a parable. Franklin possessed a voice that could soothe a wild herd of cattle or convince a man that a tax increase was a personal compliment from the government. He gathered the nation around his electronic hearth, the radio, and spoke of a neighbor whose house was on fire. "Now," said the president in essence, "if your neighbor's house is burning, you do not say to him, 'Neighbor, this hose cost me $15, and you must pay me $15 before I screw it onto the fire plug.' No, you do not want his $15. You want your hose back after the fire is put out. If the hose is smashed up in the business, the neighbor says, All right, I'll replace it. And there you are. It was a beautiful image. It conjured up a vision of two respectable suburban gentlemen in their shirt sleeves, working together in perfect Christian harmony to douse a few sparks on a roof. It completely overlooked the fact that the hose in question was a 3,000-pound flying machine designed to drop high explosives down a factory chimney, and that the fire was a monstrous, industrialized engine of destruction that was currently consuming civilization by the square mile. It also overlooked the rather obvious probability that when John Bull finally returned the hose, it would be returned in several thousand smoking fragments, smelling heavily of cordite and aviation fuel. But the American public took a deep breath, looked at the burning house, and decided that lending the hose was a sight better than going over there and fighting the firemen. Of course, the debate in the halls of Congress was not settled with the quiet dignity of a church social. The halls of the Capitol resounded with the kind of language usually reserved for horse trades and frontier brawls. The isolationists, led by men of formidable lungs and a deep-seated distrust of anything east of Long Island, rose to denounce the bill with the fury of Old Testament prophets. They declared that this was not a loan at all, but a direct gift of the nation's lifeblood to a decayed monarchy. They swore that if Bill 1776 passed, it would plow under every fourth American boy, turn the republic into a military dictatorship, and leave the country so broke it wouldn't have enough silver left to coin a dime. One senator, possessing a gift for the spectacular phrase that would have made a circus poster rider green with envy, declared that the Lend-Lease bill was nothing less than the AAA foreign policy. It would simply plow under every fourth American boy. It was a grand, terrifying piece of rhetoric, but it suffered from the fatal defect of being entirely disconnected from the mood of the country. The average American might have been stubborn, but he was not stupid. He knew that a man who refuses to lend his neighbor a bucket when the street is ablaze is liable to find his own curtains on fire before the night is out. In March, after weeks of grandiloquent speech-making that produced a mountain of congressional records and a river of tobacco juice, the bill was passed. The hardware store was officially open. Uncle Sam took off his top hat, put on a canvas apron, and began to fill orders on a scale that would have made the ancient emperors of Rome look like small-town peddlers. The terms were simple. Don't worry about the nickel, John. We'll settle up when the weather clears. Immediately, the vast, sleeping machinery of the American Republic began to groan, creak, and turn over. This was a country that had spent the last decade in the doldrums of a great economic depression, with millions of men leaning on shovels and factories standing silent and hollow like great brick cathedrals of idleness. But the magic words of Uncle Sam's infinite lease changed all that in the blinking of an eye. Suddenly, from the iron ranges of Minnesota to the shipyards of California, there was a clatter and a roar that shook the very hills. Automobile factories, which had spent 30 years perfecting the art of building comfortable sedans for Sunday drives to the lake, suddenly stopped making sedans. They began to turn out great ironclad beetles that crawled over ditches and spat lead. The makers of sewing machines turned their talents to the production of rapid-fire rifles. The manufacturers of refrigerators began to assemble the delicate mechanisms that allowed a pilot to drop a bomb through a hoop from 20,000 feet. Trainloads of wheat, bacon, steel rails, boot leather, oil, and gunpowder began to roll toward the Atlantic ports. It was an avalanche of material wealth such as the world had never seen. The United States was no longer just a nation. It was a gigantic, roaring, smokestack-belching warehouse that had pledged its entire inventory to the defense of human liberty, while remaining legally and officially a non-combatant. It was, of course, the most magnificent piece of transparent humbuggery ever practiced by a self-governing people. The German Reich looked across the water and roared with righteous indignation, pointing out that a nation which supplies your enemy with everything from biscuits to battleships cannot reasonably claim to be an innocent bystander. But Uncle Sam merely smiled his slow frontier smile, pointed to the statute books, and reminded the world that he was merely conducting a neighborly transaction involving a garden hose. If the German submarines happened to encounter those hoses in the middle of the ocean, that was a matter for the fish to decide. The tap was open, the ledger was commenced, and the great republic had discovered that while it still feared the cost of war, it possessed an infinite, unquenchable enthusiasm for the business of supply. Chapter 2. The Deputy's Moonlight Flit. If there is one thing the great architect of the universe provided to the human race in absolute, unmetered abundance, it is the capacity for a man to convince himself that a spectacularly foolish idea is, in fact, a stroke of solitary genius. History is littered with the monuments of these lone philosophers, men who decided that the best way to test the depth of a well was to jump down it with a lantern. But it was left to the year of our Lord 1941, and specifically to a dark, windy night in May, to witness what must surely be recorded as the absolute high watermark of truant logic in the history of human governance. To understand this particular manifestation of the grand human comedy, one must turn his gaze to the upper echelons of the German Reich. Now, that establishment was not known for its sense of humor, nor was it populated by men given to romantic wandering or late-night strolls in the meadow. It was a firm run by a collection of very serious, heavily decorated gentlemen who spent their afternoons drawing lines on maps of Europe and their evenings shouting at the scenery. Among this select company of geopolitical world-beaters, there stood a gentleman by the name of Herr Rudolf Hess. Herr Hess was not just any casual bystander in the great continental drama. He was the Deputy Führer, the secondary proprietor of the entire German enterprise. If the chief director of that enterprise should happen to step in front of a runaway beer wagon or be carried off by a sudden fit of apoplexy, Hess was the man legally designated to inherit the keys to the warehouse, the shouting rights at the rallies, and the grand monopoly on the national destiny. He had been there from the very beginning, a faithful hound who had spent 20 years nodding in solemn agreement every time his superior officer declared that the world was round or that the neighbors were unprincipled scoundrels. But by the spring of 1941, Rudolf was feeling a trifle left out of the fun. The grand military machine was rolling over nations like a steamroller through a clover patch, and all the glory was going to the generals with the high collars and the monocles. Hess, meanwhile, was left behind in Berlin, signing papers about the municipal tax on cabbages and listening to the distant roar of applause for other men's victories. Furthermore, he had a deep, mystical conviction, the sort of internal certainty that usually visits a man after 3 pints of dark beer and a heavy plate of sausages, that he alone possessed the secret key to global peace. He looked across the English Channel and decided that if he could only sit down with some sensible British aristocrat over a dish of tea, they could settle this whole unpleasant scrap in 20 minutes, leaving Germany free to attend to its upcoming engagement with the Russian bear without having to keep an eye on the back door. It was a magnificent piece of reasoning. It completely ignored the fact that the British government, led by that ancient cigar-chomping bulldog Winston Churchill, had spent the last year explicitly stating that they would rather turn their island into a permanent sandbar than hold a conversation with any member of the Berlin firm. It also ignored the fact that in the mid-20th century, the second-in-command of a great empire does not usually conduct diplomatic negotiations by stealing an airplane and flying off into the dark like a schoolboy running away to join the circus. But Rudolph's mind was made up, and when a man of limited imagination acquires a grand idea, he holds onto it with the desperate grip of a drowning monkey to a coconut. On the evening of May 10th, while the rest of the world was occupied with the standard business of the war, Herr Hess slipped into his finest aviator's leather coat, pockets stuffed with various homeopathic remedies, chemical concoctions for his liver, and a grand collection of charts and maps he had been hoarding like a pirate. He drove out to an airfield at Augsburg, where he had a private high-performance Messerschmitt fighter plane parked under the pretense of recreational testing. The mechanics, assuming the Deputy Führer was merely going up for a turn around the church steeples to clear his lungs, cranked the engine. Rudolf climbed into the cockpit, pulled down his goggles, and roared up into the evening sky. He did not leave a forwarding address with the office staff. He did, however, leave a letter for his chief director, to be delivered only after he had cleared the coast, a letter that would shortly cause the hair on several high-ranking Prussian necks to stand up straight like the bristles on a sweeping brush. For several hours, the Deputy Führer navigated the trackless dark over the North Sea, playing a game of hide-and-seek with the clouds and the local air defenses. It was an exhibition of piloting skill that would have been highly commendable if it had been performed by anyone whose absence wouldn't cause a national panic. As he neared the coast of Scotland, his destination being the private estate of a British duke he had met at the Olympics 5 years prior, under the impression that the duke could simply call up the king and call off the war, Rudolf ran out of both gas and geography. Finding himself over the darkened hills of Renfrewshire, with the engine spluttering its final dry protests, the second man in the German Reich decided it was time to leave the vehicle. He had never jumped out of an airplane in his life. He inverted the machine, tumbled out into the cold Scottish night, and spent a few long, solitary moments contemplating the stars before his parachute opened with the report like a pistol shot. A few minutes later, a respectable Scottish ploughman named David McLean, who was out checking on his turnips, or perhaps looking for a stray cow that had wandered into the mist, heard a heavy thump in his field. Upon investigation with a lantern, he did not find a stray calf or a sack of dropped grain. Instead, he discovered a middle-aged gentleman in an uncommonly fine uniform, smelling faintly of expensive leather and German liniment, nursing a bruised ankle in the mud. The gentleman rose, dusted the Scottish soil from his trousers with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed, and announced in broken English that he was Herr Rudolf Hess, and that he had come to see the Duke of Hamilton on an errand of international statecraft. If McLean was surprised to find the Prime Minister's deputy sitting in his turnip patch, he did not show it. The Scottish character is famously resistant to theatrical display. He simply informed the traveler that the Duke was not currently receiving visitors at midnight in a plowed field, took him by the arm, and escorted him to his cottage for a cup of tea, thereby initiating what must be called the most embarrassing diplomatic reception in the annals of the British Empire. When the news finally filtered down to London, the reaction was not one of geopolitical terror, but of profound, tongue-tied bewilderment. Winston Churchill was reportedly watching a movie when the message arrived. He listened to the frantic report that the secondary proprietor of the enemy's government had just dropped out of the sky like a rogue meteor, chewed on his cigar for a moment, and remarked that the gentleman had better be kept in a safe place while they figured out whether he was the vanguard of an invasion or merely an uncommonly prominent lunatic. But if London was embarrassed, Berlin was thrown into a state of absolute blue-purple hysterics. When the letter Rudolf left behind was finally opened, the chief director of the Reich went into a performance of shouting and furniture smashing that broke all local records. The official state radio, which had spent years built upon the doctrine that every leader in the party was a monument of infallible wisdom and iron discipline, was suddenly forced to go on the air and announce to the public that the Deputy Führer had been suffering from a long-standing mental hallucination, brought on by an excess of alternative medicine and a total collapse of his faculties, and had apparently flown off to his doom in a fit of midsummer madness. It was a beautiful spectacle. For 20 years, Hess had been the very symbol of the regime's stability, and now his own colleagues were legally declaring him a certified idiot before the British could even get his boots off. For the remainder of the great global struggle, Rudolf Hess remained in a comfortable British villa, entirely surrounded by barbed wire and suspicious guards with fixed bayonets. He spent his afternoons explaining his grand peace plans to a collection of polite but thoroughly bored army doctors, who listened with the professional patience one reserves for a man who claims he is the Emperor of China but has forgotten his laundry list. The great truant flight had accomplished absolutely nothing. It did not shorten the war by a single hour. It did not save a single turnip from destruction, and it left both sides of the grand conflict in complete agreement on only one point, that the human mind, when left to its own devices at 3,000 feet in the dark, is capable of a species of logic that would make a donkey weep with envy. Chapter 3. The Sinking of the Great German Pride. The human creature has a natural and deeply rooted affection for the colossal. From the moment the first ambitious builder stacked 3 extra mud bricks on top of his neighbor's wall to show who was master of the valley, we have been hopelessly enslaved by the gospel of the immense. If a thing is twice as large as it needs to be, we declare it magnificent. If it is 5 times as large, we declare it sacred. And if it is so big that it threatens to crack the very foundation of the earth by its mere weight, we fall down and worship it as a triumph of modern intellect. In the early months of 1941, the German Admiralty unveiled the absolute pinnacle of this heavy iron philosophy. It was a floating mountain of armor plate and high-velocity ordnance named the Bismarck. Now, this was not merely a boat. It was an empire with a rudder. It was 250,000 tons of arrogance wrapped in Krupp steel, boasting guns so large they looked like they could fire a respectable church steeple 3 towns over without straining a bolt. The gentleman in Berlin, whose fondness for large adjectives was well known, looked upon this Leviathan and openly boasted that it was completely immune to the standard hazards of the deep. They suggested that if the Atlantic Ocean knew what was good for its health, it would flatten out its waves and behave itself when the great pride of the fatherland came steaming through the mists. The plan was for this floating fortress to slip out into the wide pastures of the North Atlantic and engage in a bit of industrial-scale highway robbery, sinking those clumsy, slow-moving merchant wagons that were currently carrying Uncle Sam's garden hoses to John Bull's back door. It was a splendid plan on paper, provided you assumed the British Navy would look upon the destruction of their grocery supply with the mild Christian forbearance of a saint. In May, the great monster cleared the Baltic and turned her prow toward the open sea, accompanied by a smaller but equally impertinent companion named the Prince Eugen. They moved with the quiet stealth of a pair of 300-pound burglars wearing iron boots and walking across a tin roof. It did not take long for the neighbors to notice the racket. The British Navy, which had spent 300 years under the impression that the Atlantic was its own private fish pond, was deeply offended by this intrusion. They dispatched their own grand champion, the Hood, a vessel long regarded as the very soul of the British Empire, a beautiful, long-legged thoroughbred of the sea that had spent 20 years showing the flag in foreign ports and looking uncommonly handsome in the newspapers. The two champions met in the gray, freezing waters of the Denmark Strait on a morning when the breath turned to ice before it left the mustache. It was a brief and terrible introduction. The Bismarck looked at the elegant Hood, delivered a single thunderous salvo from her giant batteries, and struck the British ship in her internal powder house. There was a flash that made the morning sun look like a tallow candle, a roar that shook the icebergs, and the grand old symbol of British maritime majesty simply vanished into the gray water in the space of 3 minutes, leaving nothing but a greasy smudge of smoke and 3 thoroughly bewildered survivors. When the news reached London, the British establishment did not indulge in any delicate hand-wringing or dramatic fainting spells. The Admiralty did not issue a long philosophical essay on the uncertainties of naval architecture. Instead, they sent out a message to every cruiser, destroyer, battleship, submarine, and rowing boat currently flying the King's flag from the Arctic Circle to the Cape of Good Hope. It was a short, sharp piece of English prose that contained no adjectives at all. Sink the Bismarck. What followed was the most frantic, vengeful hound and fox chase in the long and damp history of naval warfare. The British Navy entirely abandoned the business of patrolling the Empire, forgot about guarding the convoys, and turned the entire North Atlantic into a single roaring dragnet. They came from the east, they came from the south, they came from the Mediterranean. Ships that had been idling in port for months suddenly blew out their boilers, piled on the coal until their funnels glowed red in the dark, and tore through the gales with a permanent grievance and a collective desire to see someone else's steelwork go to the bottom. For 3 days, the great German Leviathan played a magnificent game of blind man's buff in the fog, her paint chipped, her oil leaking from an early hit, and her crew beginning to realize that when you insult John Bull on his own doorstep, he does not send you a lawyer's letter. He sends the whole family with clubs. Yet, despite the immense weight of the pursuit, the Bismarck was within a few hours of reaching the safety of the French coast, where her friends could protect her with airplanes and shore batteries. She was running like a thief for the timberline, and the big British battleships, their coal lockers running dry and their crews half dead from lack of sleep, were beginning to fall behind in the race. It looked as though the great monument of totalitarian pride was going to slip through the noose after all. Then came the intervention of the ancient and honorable order of the canvas string bag. From the deck of the British carrier Ark Royal, which was pitching and tossing in the monstrous Atlantic rollers like a cork in a washtub, there arose a squadron of aircraft that looked like they had been salvaged from the junk pile of an early aviation pioneer. These were the Swordfish biplanes, machines built of wood, wire, and painted canvas, possessing a cruising speed that would have been considered leisurely by a respectable carrier pigeon, and equipped with open cockpits that exposed the pilots to the full freezing fury of the salt spray. They were affectionately known as string bags because they appeared to be held together by nothing more substantial than faith and old twine. To look upon a modern, radar-guided, 50,000-ton Iron Mountain like the Bismarck being challenged by a collection of flying laundry baskets, was a spectacle that should have made any serious military textbook author burst into tears. The German anti-aircraft gunners, equipped with the most delicate and expensive machinery that Berlin could buy, opened fire with a fury that turned the sky into a leaden furnace. But here, the grand intellect of the German designers ran into a snag. The guns were designed to shoot at modern, fast-moving airplanes, machines that flew with the speed of a bullet. They simply did not know how to hit a contraption that was loafing through the clouds so slowly that it practically had to change gears to go up a hill. The shells burst harmlessly ahead of the ancient biplanes, while the British pilots, their faces frozen stiff and their goggles caked with salt, looked down through the wire stays and dropped their torpedoes into the water. Most of the tin fish exploded harmlessly against the thick side armor of the giant, doing no more damage than a handful of peas thrown at a courthouse door. But one solitary torpedo, delivered by a pilot who was likely thinking of his mother or his unpaid tailor bills, struck the Bismarck at her absolute point of vulnerability, her rudder. In a single greasy second, the grand strategy of the German Reich was entirely undone by 40 square feet of twisted iron. The rudder was jammed hard to port. The great Leviathan could no longer steer for home. She could only steam in a grand, helpless, melancholy circle, turning her magnificent nose back toward the very hounds that were panting on her trail. The final act was a brutal and unscientific piece of blacksmithing. The British battleships King George V and Rodney closed in through the morning mist like a pair of heavy-set bailiffs cornering a debtor in an alley. They stood off at short range and pounded the great German pride until she was nothing but a roaring, silent, smoking wreck. Her grand steeples shot away, her flag still flying from a stump of iron, and her invincibility revealed to be a thoroughly hollow piece of promotional literature. When the great hull finally rolled over and let the Atlantic into her furnaces, she took with her the grand illusion that a nation can conquer the world by simply building its tools larger and louder than the neighbors. It was a lesson delivered at immense expense, recorded in the cold ledger of the deep, and signed by a collection of freezing young men in canvas airplanes who had demonstrated that the most magnificent monument of human arrogance is never quite a match for a sufficiency of torpedoes and a total lack of respect for the rules of size. Chapter 4. The Monumental Faces in the Granite. While the old nations of the earth were entirely occupied with the busy and expensive industry of reducing their finest cities to heaps of smoky gravel, a very different sort of explosion was taking place out in the American West. It was an explosion that had nothing to do with the settling of political grudges or the correction of national boundaries, but was instead entirely dedicated to the grand, harmless, and thoroughly American business of the spectacular. If you traveled into the Black Hills of South Dakota during the opening months of 1941, you would have found yourself in a wilderness of pine trees, granite ridges, and ancient silences that had remained largely undisturbed since the first buffalo took a notion to walk across the plains. But if you looked up at a certain precipice known as Mount Rushmore, you would have discovered that the silence was being systematically shattered by the most magnificent racket ever produced by a committee of stonecutters. There, suspended between the earth and the heavens in a collection of frail leather harnesses and rusty iron cables, was a crew of ordinary hard rock miners who had spent the last 14 years acting as the manicuring staff for a mountain. The chief director of this grand enterprise was a gentleman named Gutzon Borglum. Now, Gutzon was not a man to do things on a scale that could fit into a parlor. He was an artist whose imagination required a whole township for a canvas and a stick of dynamite for a pencil. He looked upon a majestic, unoffending cliff that had been standing perfectly straight for 3 million years, and immediately felt a holy call to alter its features with heavy artillery, steam drills, and a permanent staff of gentlemen who weren't afraid of falling 500 feet onto a pile of rocks before dinner. The plan was to chisel the features of 4 American presidents into the very bone of the continent: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. It was an idea so beautifully unnecessary, so grandly audacious, that it could only have been hatched in a republic that feels a chronic need to leave its signature on everything it owns, preferably in letters so large they can be read from the moon by an interested astronomer. By March of 1941, the project was nearing its final accounting. Gutzon Borglum, after spending nearly a generation dodging political critics, financial panics, and the occasional lightning bolt that took a fancy to his scaffolding, finally laid down his earthly chisel and passed away, leaving the final touches to be completed by his son, Lincoln. It was a race against the calendar, for the great clock of human events was ticking loud and heavy, and Uncle Sam's hardware store was already getting so busy that there would soon be very little leisure left for recreational stone cutting. To appreciate the sheer glorious absurdity of the spectacle, one must imagine the daily routine of the work. Every morning, a collection of local boys, mostly miners who had spent their lives looking for gold in the dark, climbed to the top of the mountain, ate a sandwich, and then allowed themselves to be lowered over the edge of a precipice in little wooden chairs that swung in the mountain breeze like laundry on a line. They did not spend their time with the delicate, soft-bristled brushes or the little silver hammers of the traditional sculptor. They worked with 300-pound pneumatic drills that roared like a pack of iron lions, boring holes into the granite with a fury that shook the teeth in their gums. After they had drilled a sufficient number of holes, they would pack them full of dynamite, climb back over the ridge, and blow a 4-ton block of South Dakota off the mountain, with a report that would wake up the jackrabbits 3 counties away. It was sculpture by execution. If a man made a mistake with a traditional chisel in a studio, he might spoil a block of marble the size of a turnip. If one of Borglum's boys got a little too enthusiastic with the electric battery, he was liable to blow Thomas Jefferson's left ear into the middle of the next valley, or leave Abraham Lincoln without a chin to support his philosophy. Yet, despite the unscientific nature of the tools, the work proceeded with a species of miraculous accuracy that suggests the angels must have been keeping an eye on the plumb lines. The proportions were colossal. George Washington's nose was longer than a respectable country wagon. His eyes were wide enough to accommodate a couple of comfortable rocking chairs. And his mouth was a cavern that could have served as a garage for a pair of Model T Fords, if the Park Service had been minded to take the cars up there. The isolationists in the East looked upon this grand expenditure of public funds and shook their heads with great solemnity. They wondered why a nation that was currently trying to save its skin by renting out garden hoses to John Bull should spend its silver making sure that 4 dead politicians could stare out over the wilderness until the day of judgment. They suggested that the money would be better spent on armor plate or sacks of flour. But the average American looked at the newspapers, saw those giant stone faces slowly emerging from the pine trees, and felt a deep, unspeakable satisfaction. There was something comforting about the fact that while Europe was entirely occupied with the business of pulling down its old monuments, Uncle Sam was out in the backyard building new ones on a scale that made the Sphinx look like a garden ornament. It was a declaration to the world that whatever might happen to the geography of the old countries, the American Republic intended to remain right where it was, with its old leaders keeping a permanent watch over the prairies. In October of 1941, the funding ran dry. The national emergency grew too loud to ignore, and the work was officially declared finished. The men packed up their drills, wound up the cables, and left the four gentlemen to their solitary contemplation of the South Dakota weather. They were finished just in time. 2 months later, the great republic would find itself in a situation where every ounce of dynamite was needed for the manufacture of artillery shells, and every man who knew how to handle a drill would be wearing a tin hat in a very different sort of ditch. The giant faces remain there to this day, a grand monument to the American fondness for the large gesture. They stand as a permanent proof that if you give a free citizen a sufficient quantity of black powder, a comfortable leather swing, and a mountain that is minding its own business, he will not rest until he has carved his own history into the everlasting granite, leaving a ledger that cannot be rubbed out by the frost, altered by a treaty, or forgotten by a world that was about to go entirely mad before the winter was out. Chapter 5. The Violation of the Thief's Agreement. It has long been a maxim among the more experienced practitioners of the light-fingered arts that if you intend to engage in a partnership for the purpose of plundering the neighborhood, you had best choose a partner whose conscience is at least as flexible as your own. But the true beauty of the arrangement, the exquisite, delicate charm of the business, only reaches its full perfection when two absolute, unmitigated rascals, each possessing a certificate of high moral character signed by himself, sit down at a table to divide a territory that belongs to a third party who was not invited to the meeting. In the late summer of 1939, such a meeting had taken place between the Berlin firm of Herr Hitler and the Moscow establishment of Comrade Stalin. Now, these two gentlemen had spent the better part of a decade calling each other every species of ideological reptile known to the political dictionary. They had shouted at each other across the newspapers. They had shaken their fists at each other from their respective balconies. And they had led their respective publics to believe that if they should ever happen to inhabit the same room, the laws of chemistry would break down and the house would immediately dissolve into a shower of sparks and brimstone. Yet, when it became convenient for both parties to take a turn through Poland and see what was left in the drawers, they dropped their grievances with the swiftness of a schoolboy dropping a hot potato. They signed a document known to the world as the Non-Aggression Pact, though a more accurate description would have been a thief's agreement to keep one hand on the watch pocket while the other is in the neighbor's till. They shook hands with a solemnity that would have done credit to a pair of bishops, toasted each other's health in sweet wine and vodka, and swore by all that was holy that they would remain the dearest of friends until the rivers ran dry and the mountains turned to jelly. It was a beautiful arrangement. Provided you didn't look too closely at the matches, each gentleman was quietly scraping under the table. By the summer of 1941, however, the ink on this grand testament of eternal love was looking remarkably dusty. Herr Hitler had spent the intervening 2 years clearing the western landscape of all competition, and he was now standing on the edge of his grand estate, looking eastward toward the immense, trackless acres of the Soviet Union with the watery eye of a wolf who has just finished the sheep next door and noticed a very large fat cow idling in the next pasture. To the German intellect, which has always been hopelessly enslaved by the beauty of a large, orderly map, the Russian territory was an intolerable provocation. It was simply too big to be left in the hands of a man who wore such an uncommonly large mustache and smoked such an unpatriotic pipe as Joseph Stalin. Furthermore, The Berlin director had a grand philosophical theory, the sort of magnificent mental vapor that usually visits a man who has spent too much time listening to brass bands and not enough time walking in the cold, that if you only kicked in the front door of the Russian house, the whole rotten structure would immediately collapse into a pile of toothpicks, leaving the German tenant to enjoy the wheat fields of the Ukraine and the oil wells of the Caucasus, without any further backtalk from the locals. Comrade Stalin, meanwhile, was conducting his side of the partnership with the deep, serene slumber of a man who believes that because he has a signed receipt from a burglar, his spoons are perfectly safe in the sideboard. Every morning the British government, which spent a great deal of time and money listening to the secret German telegraphs, would send a polite note to Moscow, stating with the utmost precision that Herr Hitler was currently assembling 3 million heavily armed tourists along the Russian border, complete with tanks, airplanes, and a very large supply of winter overcoats. They suggested that it might be an excellent time for the Soviet army to stop digging ditches and start looking at the scenery, but Stalin merely stroked his whiskers, spat upon the floor, and declared that this was nothing but a wicked capitalistic plot designed by Winston Churchill to stir up trouble between two respectable, peace-loving neighbors. He was so convinced of his own shrewdness that when his own border guards reported that German reconnaissance planes were flying over Russian airfields and taking photographs of the cabbage patches, he issued a strict order that no one was to shoot back, lest the German guest should take offense and think they lacked hospitality. On the night of June 21st, trainloads of Russian grain and petroleum were still rolling westward across the border. A final, punctual installment of the trade agreement delivered by the Moscow firm with the touching reliability of an old milk horse directly into the hands of the very men who were currently greasing their bayonets for the morning's work. At 3 o'clock the following morning, the grand illusion went up in a sheet of flame that was 500 miles wide. Operation Barbarossa commenced with a racket that made all the previous noise in France and Belgium look like a quiet game of croquet on a rectory lawn. 3 million German soldiers, organized into the most terrifyingly efficient machine that ever turned a wheel, crossed the frontier without so much as a "by your leave" or a postcard to the authorities. They brought with them thousands of iron beetles that tore through the wheat fields and hundreds of flying hornets that turned the Russian Air Force into a collection of smoking bonfires before the pilots could even find their trousers. When the news was finally brought to Comrade Stalin in his private quarters at the Kremlin, the great strategist did not issue a thunderous manifesto to the world. He did not rise to the occasion with the majestic wrath of an injured emperor. Instead, he went into a state of profound, absolute, and tongue-tied retirement that lasted for several days, a silence so heavy you could have heard a flea cough in the middle of the Red Square. He discovered, with the sudden clarity that usually comes to a man after he has stepped off a roof in the dark, that when you sign a treaty with a totalitarian gentleman, you are not purchasing peace. You are merely checking his pockets to see how many matches he has left. The world looked upon this grand betrayal with a mixture of horror and a certain irrepressible unchristian amusement. Winston Churchill, who had spent 20 years denouncing the Moscow regime as a nest of unprincipled villains, did not hesitate for a single second. He went on the radio that very night and announced that Great Britain would give every ounce of help it could find to the Russian people. "If Hitler invaded hell," remarked Churchill, with that splendid gift for the theological phrase that always cheered up the British public, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Uncle Sam, too, looked out from his busy hardware store, took a fresh pencil from behind his ear, and opened a brand new page in the Great Continental tab. He decided that if Comrade Stalin was going to spend his summer shooting at Herr Hitler, it was only fair to send him a few thousand trucks, 1,000,000 boots, and enough canned pork to keep the Soviet engine running until the weather turned cold. The great partnership of the two rascals had lasted less than 2 years, and it had concluded with the most magnificent exhibition of back-alley geometry ever recorded in the ledger of human folly. It proved to all the world that the only thing more dangerous than being the enemy of a global reformer is being his best friend. And it left the human race locked in a struggle so vast and so terrible that before the snow began to fly, both Berlin and Moscow would find that the old treaty was the only piece of paper in the world that wasn't worth the price of the firewood needed to burn it. Chapter 6. The Scorched Earth and the Stubborn Moujik. When a man of expansive vision and limited geographical experience sits down with a ruler to map out the conquest of an empire, his calculations almost invariably suffer from a lack of intimate acquaintance with mud. It is a substance which does not appear on the finer geopolitical charts designed in Berlin. On those grand sheets of paper, 1,000 square miles of Eastern territory looks as smooth, flat, and hospitable as a freshly planed billiard table inviting a grand mechanized excursion with nothing more complicated than an occasional glance at the signposts. But the Creator, when he laid out the immense trackless backyard of the Russian continent, was evidently in a highly unhurried frame of mind. He provided millions upon millions of acres of pine forest, birch grove, and black soil. And then, to ensure the landscape remained exclusive, he decreed that for several months out of every year, the entire country should systematically dissolve into a thick gray pudding that could swallow a horse by the ears and leave no trace of the animal but its owner's hat. By the late summer of 1941, the grand German military engine, which had spent the last 2 months rolling eastward with the terrifying precision of a high-priced factory clock, was beginning to discover that the Russian house was entirely different from the small, tidy establishments they had previously redecorated in the West. In France, when the firm took over the property, they found the roads beautifully paved, the bridges neatly labeled, and the local authorities perfectly prepared to hand over the municipal keys with a polite bow and a legal receipt. But out on the great steps there were no keys, very few roads worthy of the name, and the local resident, the stubborn Russian peasant or moujik, showed a total and distressing lack of interest in the finer points of European etiquette. When the German columns arrived at a respectable-looking village, expecting to find the local mayor waiting on the porch with a white flag and a dish of fresh plums, they found instead nothing but a collection of smoldering chimneys and a few very angry crows. For Comrade Stalin, having finally recovered from his grand midnight surprise at the Kremlin, had issued a manifesto that was completely devoid of any delicate Christian forbearance. It was called the Scorched Earth Decree, though it might more accurately have been titled the Grand Policy of Leaving the Guest Without a Spoon. The instructions to the population were simple, sharp, and entirely free of ambiguity. If you must retreat before the advancing iron beetles, you must not leave behind so much as a single bushel of wheat, a solitary cow, a gallon of kerosene, or a workable bicycle. What you cannot carry away on your back, you must smash with an axe. What you cannot smash, you must drop down the well. And what you cannot drop down the well, you must set fire to with a match until the entire landscape looks like the back end of a blacksmith shop on a rainy Tuesday. It was an uncommonly thorough piece of housework. It completely inverted the ancient laws of property. For generations, the peasant had spent his life guarding his little stack of grain and his small patch of cabbages from the frost, the crows, and the tax collector with the ferocity of a terrier. Yet now, at a word from the Grand Director in Moscow, he would calmly walk out to his own barn, look at his finest milk cow, sigh with immense solemnity, and then set fire to his own roof tree with the quiet determination of a man performing a holy duty. To the German soldier, whose mind had been trained to believe that the primary purpose of an enemy is to surrender when his position becomes mathematically untenable, this behavior was a species of low-grade cheating. The advanced columns would roll into a town that had been marked on their maps as a prime spot for a warm supper and a comfortable night's lodging. Instead of a bed, they found a field of hot ash that smelled of burnt feathers. Instead of a storehouse of flour, they found nothing but a black slurry, where the local cooperative had mixed the grain supply with kerosene and horse manure to ensure it wouldn't sit well on a Prussian stomach. Even the great Dnieper Dam, the absolute pride of the Soviet industrial enterprise, a magnificent mountain of concrete that the newspapers had hailed for 10 years as the very symbol of modern progress, was blown into a million fragments by its own engineers, sending a wall of water roaring down the river simply to ensure the invading team couldn't use the electricity to run their laundry machines. This was not war according to the textbooks. It was a grand, continent-wide performance of mutual destruction that suggested the human race had grown entirely weary of its own architecture. Through it all, the ordinary Russian soldier retreated backward through the dust and the heat with a stubborn, silent, oxen-like resilience that completely bewildered the Berlin planners. He was frequently surrounded. He was cut off from his sausages. He was pounded by the flying hornets from morning until night. And according to the grand calculations published every Wednesday by the Berlin press office, he had already been legally annihilated 3 times over. Yet, instead of laying down his rifle and holding up his hands like a sensible fellow who knows when he is beaten, the Moujik would simply retire into the nearest birch forest, pull his belt 3 holes tighter, dissolve into the scenery, and wait for the sun to go down so he could creep back and do something unprincipled to a German ammunition wagon with a length of old pipe and a pocketful of gunpowder. The German generals looked out from their open staff cars, their uniforms caked with a fine yellow dust that made them look like a convention of miller's clerks, and began to feel a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. They looked at their odometers, which showed they had already traveled farther than the entire length of Germany, and then they looked at the horizon, which remained precisely as wide, gray, and empty as it had been on the first morning of the campaign. They had captured 500,000 prisoners. They had smashed 3,000 tanks. They had occupied territory large enough to hold 4 respectable kingdoms. And yet, the main result of their industry was that they were now simply 500 miles deeper into a country that clearly detested their presence and had zero intention of offering them a chair. By September, the long, hot summer of 41 was beginning to pack up its bags. The dust, which had been the chief affliction of the traveler for 3 months, suddenly vanished, to be replaced by the first cold, gray rains of the autumn. Within 48 hours, the unpaved tracks of the Ukraine transformed from hard clay into a bottomless, sticky broth that the locals called rasputitsa, a word that translates roughly to the season of no roads, or more accurately, the period when the earth turns into a general trap. The great iron beetles, which had looked so magnificent when tearing through the dry wheat fields, suddenly found themselves sunk up to their axles in a substance that had the consistency of molasses and the adhesive power of institutional glue. A supply wagon that had previously required 2 horses now required 10. And even then, the animals were liable to emerge from the business without their shoes. The grand advance did not stop, but it lost its beautiful, mechanical rhythm. It became a miserable, mud-splattered crawl, punctuated by the oaths of teamsters and the snapping of tow ropes. And behind every bush, in every blackened cellar, and across every trackless mile of swamp, the stubborn Moujik stood in his muddy boots, leaned on his spade, and watched the great German pride slowly grind itself to pieces against the sheer size of the geography, waiting with the immense, terrible patience of a man who knows that General Winter is already in the next county, looking over his ledger and preparing his boots for the road. Chapter 7. The Meeting on the Foggy Waters. When 2 of the world's primary political operators decide they have an urgent need to discuss the state of the planet's health, they do not usually choose a location that requires them to wear oilskins and hold onto a rail to keep from being pitched into a tub of salt water. The standard practice of the trade is to select a very large, heavily upholstered palace in a quiet capital where the carpets are 3 inches thick, the brandy is ancient, and the only sound is the discreet scratching of a clerk's pen across a piece of expensive parchment. But by the middle of August, in the year of our Lord 1941, the land had become entirely too loud for a quiet conversation. Every palace in Europe was either occupied by a gentleman in a trench coat who had not been invited by the owner, or was currently positioned within the daily flight path of a 3-ton cylinder of high explosives. If Mr. Franklin Roosevelt and Mr. Winston Churchill wished to sit down together to compare notes on the global circus, they had to find a spot that was completely out of reach of the continental telegraphs, the roaming iron hornets, and the long, sharp noses of the Atlantic submarines. They chose a lonely, fog-choked anchorage off the coast of Newfoundland called Placentia Bay, a place where the sky is the color of an old pewter mug, the water is permanently freezing, and the local population consists primarily of codfish who mind their own business. The manner of their arrival was a masterpiece of transparent mystery. The American president, having informed his press corps that he was going on a recreational fishing cruise to ease his gout and admire the scenery, slipped away from his yacht on a fast Navy cruiser named the Augusta. He did not take any reporters. He did not take his usual collection of political advisers, and he left behind a staff instructed to issue daily bulletins regarding the excellent state of his luck with the sea bass, a performance of pure frontier bunkum that kept the newspapers perfectly occupied while the chief magistrate was steaming north through the mists at 25 knots. From the other direction came the British Prime Minister, stowed away in the belly of the magnificent new battleship Prince of Wales. Winston had just crossed 3,000 miles of a very hostile ocean, an ocean that was currently being patrolled by dozens of German captains who would have given their left arms to present their chief director in Berlin with the prize of a British bulldog in a cage. But Churchill cared no more for the submarines than he did for the damp weather. He spent the voyage reading novels, pacing the deck in a merchant captain's hat, and smoking cigars that were large enough to be used as clubs by a small policeman. On the morning of August 9th, the 2 great vessels came together in the gray waters of the bay, looking like 2 massive iron castles that had floated away from their respective continents and decided to form a temporary alliance in the wilderness. The spectacle that followed was one of the most curious exhibitions of international harmony ever witnessed by a collection of seagulls. For 4 days, the 2 leaders and their respective staffs lived in a state of high-toned seafaring intimacy. The British officers, immaculate in their blue broadcloth and gold braid, climbed over the side of the American ships to sample the legendary hospitality of Uncle Sam's Navy, which included an abundance of fresh beef, real ice cream, and a complete lack of any liquid stronger than coffee. The American fleet having been legally dried out by an act of Congress many years prior. The Americans, meanwhile, returned the visit, marveling at the British capacity to consume vast quantities of Scotch whiskey at 10 o'clock in the morning without losing their place in a sentence. On Sunday morning, the entire company gathered on the quarterdeck of the Prince of Wales for a joint church service. It was a scene that would have made a stone statue weep with sentiment. There stood the President, leaning heavily on the arm of his son. There stood the Prime Minister, his pocket handkerchief out and his eyes thoroughly leakier than a standard bucket. And all around them were hundreds of British and American sailors packed together shoulder to shoulder under the great muzzles of the 14-inch guns, singing old hymns about Christian soldiers and ancient foundations. It was a magnificent declaration to the world that even if Uncle Sam was legally a non-combatant whose principal contribution to the scrap was a long hardware tab, his heart was precisely in the same corner of the yard as John Bull's. But the real business of the meeting, the intellectual fruit of this damp excursion, was a piece of paper that came to be known as the Atlantic Charter. Now, if a man sits down in a warm study to draft a constitution for a state or a contract for a mule trade, he is usually very careful to ensure he has the legal authority to enforce the terms. But the beauty of the Atlantic Charter, the exquisite, whimsical charm of the document, lay in the fact that neither of the gentlemen who drew it up possessed a single shred of constitutional right to promise anything of the sort. Mr. Roosevelt was the leader of a republic that was officially at peace with the world, and whose Congress had spent the last 5 years passing laws specifically designed to prevent the executive branch from making promises to foreign powers. Mr. Churchill was the Prime Minister of an empire that was currently fighting for its bare life, and whose future ability to pay its grocery bill was an open question among the smarter bankers in Wall Street. Yet there they sat in the Admiral's cabin, with the fog banging against the portholes and the ship rolling in the swells, writing a grand poetic prospectus for the management of the human race after the current lunacy had been cleared away. They promised that when the trouble was over, there would be no more stealing of other people's territory. They decreed that every nation, no matter how small or how unprovided with artillery, should have the right to choose its own form of government. They declared that the great highways of the ocean should be open to all travelers without any backtalk from the neighbors. And they suggested that the entire human family should lay down its clubs, pull off its heavy boots, and live together in a state of permanent industrialized peace and plenty. It was a beautiful piece of literature. It had the noble cadence of the Psalms and the spacious optimism of a real estate prospectus for a town that had not yet been built. It was signed with a high degree of solemnity, stamped with the grand seals of state, and then transmitted to the telegraphs of the world, where it caused an immediate and tremendous sensation. The German Reich, looking out from its newly conquered cabbage patches in Russia, roared with laughter at the news. The Berlin papers pointed out with great clarity that a document promising freedom for all, signed by the master of the British Empire and the protector of the American cash drawer, was a piece of transparent humbuggery that wouldn't deceive a sensible chicken. But the ordinary folk of the earth, The people who had spent the last 2 years dodging the Iron Hornets in London, or watching their crops burn in the Ukraine, or wondering if their boys would soon be wearing a tin hat in some unnamed ditch, looked at that piece of Navy stationery and felt a sudden, inexplicable lifting of the spirit. They did not care about the lack of legal authority. They did not care that the document had no more teeth than a newborn rabbit. They simply liked the idea that somewhere out in the great Atlantic fog, two respectable gentlemen with large navies had taken the trouble to draw up a ledger of common decency and had signed their names to the radical notion that the planet belonged to its residents rather than to the fellows with the straitjackets. When the conference was over, the ships weighed anchor and departed their separate ways into the mists. The president went back to his fishing yacht to report that the bass were biting uncommonly well, and the prime minister returned to his island to see about the gunpowder supply. They left Placentia Bay precisely as cold, gray, and empty as they had found it. But they had left behind a document that would hang over the rest of the great struggle like a permanent ghost, reminding every tyrant on the landscape that before the Ledger of 41 was concluded, they would have to settle their accounts with a pair of sailors who had already drawn up the rules for the peace before they had even finished arranging the war. Chapter 8. The Siege of the Sandcastles. There is an old and very popular delusion among the military philosophers that if you wish to conduct a successful campaign, you must first secure a piece of territory that is uncommonly beautiful, highly fertile, and filled with some species of property that is worth the trouble of a lawsuit. But it was left to the peculiar genius of the year of our Lord 1941 to demonstrate that the most bitter, stubborn, and expensive argument of the entire season should be carried on over a miserable little patch of sun-baked desolation that didn't possess enough fresh water to drown a cricket or enough grass to satisfy a grasshopper with a small appetite. This particular piece of real estate was a small Mediterranean port called Tobruk, situated on the northern coast of Africa. Now, if a man were to look at Tobruk from the deck of a passing steamer, he would not immediately be struck by its resemblance to the Garden of Eden. It was a dusty collection of white plaster hovels, a few rusty oil tanks, and a harbor that was largely populated by the wrecks of old Italian steamers that had been previously introduced to the British Navy. All around it, for 1,000 miles in every direction, was the great desert, an immense, unmeasured expanse of yellow sand, loose gravel, and flies, where the thermometer regularly climbed to a height that would make a brass boiler look around for a shade tree, and where the wind had a playful habit of picking up a sand dune and blowing it through a man's whiskers at 40 miles an hour. Yet, because this dreary outpost possessed the only reliable deep-water dock between Egypt and the middle of nowhere, it suddenly became the most desirable piece of architecture on the continent. By the spring of 1941, the Axis managers had sent a new director to take charge of the African department. This was Herr Erwin Rommel, a general who possessed a gift for the spectacular maneuver that would have done credit to a frontier Indian scout or a circus manager. He had arrived in the desert with a collection of high-velocity iron beetles called the Africa Corps, and he had immediately set about chasing the British forces across the sand with a velocity that left both sides thoroughly out of breath and entirely covered in dust. He rolled over the desert like a sudden summer thunderstorm, capturing waterholes, bagging generals, and leading the Berlin radio to announce that the British Empire was about to be entirely evicted from the neighborhood of the pyramids. But as Herr Rommel chased the main British army back toward the Egyptian border, his iron beetles ran into an obstacle that would not move. It was the garrison of Tobruk. The primary residents of this iron sandcastle were the members of the 9th Australian Division, a collection of independent, long-legged young men who had come from the sheep stations and bush towns of the southern hemisphere to see what the European emergency was about. They were men who had been raised on a diet of hard work, immense distances, and a total lack of respect for any human creature who wore a mustache that required a special comb or a uniform that was too clean for a horse trade. They wore slouch hats with the brim pinned up on one side. They possessed a speaking cadence that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in a pine board, and they looked upon the grand military science of the German Reich with the mild skeptical amusement of a horse trader looking at a bicycle. When Rommel's advanced columns arrived outside the town, expecting the garrison to pack its bags and retire with the usual military decorum, the Australians simply dug themselves into the limestone ditches, greased their machine guns, and invited the visitors to come on in and see how the water tasted. The Berlin radio, which always liked to keep its language on a high philosophical level, immediately issued a bulletin describing the defenders as rats, unprincipled rodents who had crawled into the holes in the rocks and refused to come out like gentlemen to be properly annihilated by the artillery. It was an unfortunate choice of words. The Australians took a deep breath, looked at their dusty trousers, and decided that if they were to be known as rats, they would be the most troublesome, sharp-toothed rodents that ever infested a cellar. They officially adopted the title of the Desert Rats, and they set about defending their sandcastle with a species of low-grade back-alley mathematics that entirely unseated the calculations of the Axis planners. The siege lasted for nearly 250 days, and it quickly settled into a daily routine that was completely devoid of any traditional romance. The heat was of the sort that turns a man's brain into a soft pudding. The water was brought in by old Navy tankers, and it had been stored in kerosene tins so often that it tasted like a mixture of old boots and aviation fuel, causing a cup of tea to look like an oil slick and smell like a garage. The food consisted almost entirely of hard sea biscuit and a species of tinned beef that was known to the trade as bully, but which the Australians swore had been salvaged from the rations left over from the Boer War. It was a diet that did not encourage a delicate appetite, but it appeared to agree remarkably well with the Australian Constitution, which thrived on adversity and was entirely immune to the local flies. Every afternoon, Herr Rommel would send his iron beetles forward to crack the perimeter. The tanks would roar over the limestone ridges, their guns spitting fire, accompanied by the flying hornets of the Luftwaffe, which dropped 200-pound cylinders of TNT through the roofs of the old Italian barracks. But as soon as the dust cleared, the rats would emerge from their limestone burrows. They would ignore the tanks, allowing the great iron monsters to roll right over the ditches, and then they would rise up with their rifles and bayonets to deal with the infantry that was following behind. It was a performance that lacked the beautiful mechanical rhythm of the Prussian textbooks. It was a rough-and-tumble frontier business, carried on in the dark of night or through the suffocating clouds of a dust storm, where a man couldn't see his own thumb if he held it before his nose. The Australians did not content themselves with sitting in their holes and waiting for the bell to ring. Every night, when the desert moon went behind a cloud, they would slip out into the wire entanglements in their stockinged feet, their faces blackened with burnt cork and their pockets stuffed with hand grenades. They would creep across the sand with the silence of ghosts, slip into the enemy's forward trenches, capture a couple of machine guns, turn them around to fire into the neighbor's kitchen, and then vanish back into the mist before the local officers could even find their boots. By the autumn of 1941, Herr Rommel had spent several thousand tons of high-grade ammunition, ruined the tracks of 100 excellent tanks, and lost the use of several thousand valuable soldiers. And yet he was precisely as far from the center of Tobruk as he had been on the first morning of the spring. The little white town on the rocks remained an immovable obstacle in his path, a permanent leak in his supply line that prevented him from taking his iron beetles down to Cairo to see the Sphinx. The siege of the sandcastles proved to all the world that when you are engaged in the business of global conquest, you must eventually reckon with the ordinary, unpolished human creature who doesn't care a nickel for your grand historical destiny. It showed that a collection of sheep shearers and clerks from the back blocks of New South Wales, when provided with a sufficiency of ammunition, a permanent grievance, and a total lack of any alternative lodging, could turn a miserable patch of sand and flies into a monument of human endurance that would stand out in the ledger of 41 long after the grand plans of the Berlin directors had been covered over by the drifting desert gravel. Chapter 9. The Rosebud of the Celluloid King. While the great iron-shod nations of the earth were entirely occupied with the busy and expensive industry of altering the boundaries of empires with heavy artillery, a very different sort of explosion was preparing itself in a quiet corner of California. This was an explosion that had nothing to do with the settling of international boundary lines or the movement of 3 million men in boots, but was instead entirely confined to a few thousand feet of coated plastic ribbon, a handful of electric lanterns, and the radical notions of a 25-year-old upstart who had been given the keys to a playground before he was old enough to know the rules of the house. The young man's name was Orson Welles. Now, Orson was not what you would call a modest or a retiring violet. He was a creature born with a voice that sounded like a church organ played by a man who had spent his life drinking rich cream, and he possessed an imagination that could not fit into a standard theater without bulging the bricks out at the sides. A few years prior, he had thrown the entire American Republic into a state of blue-purple hysterics by merely reading a romance about some imaginary mechanics from Mars over the radio on a Sunday evening, a performance that caused thousands of respectable citizens to abandon their suppers, pack their valuables into the family sedan, and flee into the woods under the impression that the solar system was being liquidated by the neighbors. Having thus demonstrated that he could conquer the continent with nothing more substantial than a microphone and a few sound effects involving a piece of old tin and a squash, the managers of the celluloid trade in Hollywood decided that this was precisely the sort of fellow they needed to invigorate their own ledger. They brought him out to California, handed him a contract that allowed him to make any kind of moving picture he fancied without any back talk from the boardroom, and then stood back with their fingers in their ears to see how much of the scenery he would blow up before the year was out. The result of this grand experiment was a moving picture called Citizen Kane. To appreciate the sheer glorious audacity of the business, one must understand that Hollywood in 1941 was a very orderly kingdom, run by a collection of heavy-set gentlemen who spent their afternoons manufacturing beautiful, high-toned romances, designed to assure the public that everything was bound to turn out perfectly splendid by the final reel, provided the hero had a clean shirt and the heroine didn't lose her hat in the gale. They had regular mechanical ways of placing the lanterns, moving the boxes, and telling the story, and they looked upon any variation from the manual with the cold Christian disapproval of a deacon discovering a deck of cards in the pulpit. But Orson Welles took the Hollywood manual, threw it into the nearest furnace room, and set about inventing a new way of looking at the human creature through a glass lens. He hired a genius of the lantern named Billy Bitzer, or rather, Greg Toland, a man who could do things with a shadow that would make a ghost look twice. And together they built a machine that allowed a spectator to see everything in a room at once, from a man's waistcoat buttons in the foreground to the fly walking on the wallpaper 50 feet behind him. They cut holes in the floor to get the camera down where it could look up at the actors, making them look as large, heavy, and ominous as 4-ton statues in a public square. They played tricks with the clocks. They jumped backward and forward through time like a grasshopper in a clover field. And they introduced the radical notion that a story didn't have to behave like an ordinary train ride from one town to the next, but could instead be pieced together out of the gossip, the grumbling, and the faulty memories of 5 different people who didn't agree on the facts anyway. But the real trouble, the magnificent, thunderous row that nearly brought the whole celluloid palace down about their ears, lay in the subject of the story itself. For Citizen Kane was not a romance about an imaginary king and a distant principality. It was a thinly disguised, uncommonly sharp-toothed biography of a very real, very loud, and very wealthy gentleman named William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was the absolute monarch of the American printing press, a man who owned dozens of great newspapers from coast to coast, possessed an income that looked like the national debt of a respectable kingdom, and had spent 50 years under the impression that the primary purpose of the United States was to provide him with a fresh sheet of news every morning to scribble his opinions upon. He was an individual who had single-handedly started a war with Spain back in '98 because he thought it would improve the circulation of his Sunday supplement. And he lived in a monstrous stone palace on a hill in California called San Simeon, which was so stuffed with old tapestries, carved ceilings, and imported European junk that a visitor couldn't sit down without risking a collision with a 15th century saint or a stuffed elk. When this grand old tyrant discovered that a 25-year-old actor with an uncommonly loud voice had spent his summer making a moving picture that showed a newspaper king who looked precisely like Hearst, lived in a palace that looked precisely like San Simeon, and died in a state of profound, absolute loneliness because he had tried to buy the love of the world with ink and silver. Well, the performance that followed broke all local records for political fireworks. Hearst did not send a polite note to the studio. He turned the full, crushing weight of his entire newspaper empire against the young man and his picture. Suddenly, from New York to San Francisco, the Hearst editors discovered that Orson Welles was a dangerous radical, an unprincipled scoundrel, and a fellow whose mere presence in California was an insult to the flag and the public morals. The papers refused to print a single advertisement for the movie. They refused to mention Welles's name, except when they could couple it with some dark hint of treason or low-grade cheating. And the agents of the Hearst firm went around to the theater owners with a heavy club, informing them that if they should be so foolish as to show Citizen Kane to the public, their houses would never again receive a single line of notice or a single nickel of advertising from the great press lord's establishment. One high-ranking studio manager, so thoroughly terrified by the grand old man's wrath that his knees were knocking together like castanets, actually offered to pay the RKO company $800,000 out of his own pocket if they would simply take the negative of Welles's masterpiece out into the backyard and set fire to it before anyone else could see it. It was a beautiful spectacle. It proved that a man can acquire $50 million, half the timberlands of the West, and a private zoo filled with lions and giraffes, and yet remain so thin-skinned that a few hundred feet of celluloid can cause him to break his own furniture in a fit of midsummer madness. But Orson Welles stood his ground with the majestic, unbothered serenity of a man who knows he has invented a better mousetrap. The picture was released in May of 1941, and while it did not make a fortune at the ticket windows, the Hearst boycott having succeeded in scaring off a good portion of the country store trade, it completely revolutionized the business of storytelling from that hour forward. The movie concluded with a mystery that has puzzled the philosophers ever since. As the great tycoon lies dying in his immense, drafty palace, surrounded by 3 townships of marble statues and old crates, his final breath escapes him with a single melancholy word: Rosebud. The investigators spend the rest of the picture trying to discover what grand secret political intrigue or hidden love affair was contained in that word, only for the final scene to reveal to the spectator that Rosebud was nothing more than the trade name of a cheap wooden sled the old man had owned when he was a happy boy of 8, back in a snowy valley before he ever saw a dollar or learned how to ruin a neighbor with a headline. It was a magnificent piece of irony to throw into the ledger of 41. It suggested to a distracted public, which was currently watching the great captains of the earth tear civilization to pieces in their race for global dominion, that a man can conquer the entire world with ink, steel, or gunpowder, and yet die so hollow that his spirit would gladly trade the whole magnificent smoke-belching empire for a 5-cent toy and a cold afternoon in the backyard of his youth. Chapter 10. The Unbroken Summer of the Splendid Stick. There is a deep-seated conviction embedded in the breast of every proper American that when the great machine of human progress begins to rattle, clank, and blow its gaskets under the pressure of foreign complications, the most sensible thing a man can do is to look at the daily baseball score. It is a secular religion established for the express purpose of saving the national sanity during those seasons when the political governors are behaving like a convention of escaped lunatics. If a citizen can tell you precisely who is leading the league in shortstop assists and what the local pitcher did to his elbow on a Thursday afternoon, he feels he has a firm, immovable anchor in the gray limestone of reality, no matter how many treaties are being torn up by the neighbors across the water. In the early summer of 1941, the great republic stood in urgent need of just such an anchor. The atmosphere was uncommonly thick with the smoke of distant furnaces, and the radio was daily delivering a cargo of heavy leaden news about the destruction of old cities and the infinite expansion of Uncle Sam's hardware tab. But just as the national nervous system was about to give way under the strain of chronic anxiety, there emerged from the dugout of the New York Yankees a tall, lean, uncommonly quiet young man who looked as though he had never heard a political speech in his life and wouldn't have cared a nickel for the text if he had. His name was Joseph Paul DiMaggio, though the practitioners of the sporting press, a fraternity never known for its economy of adjectives, affectionately referred to him as the Yankee Clipper. Joe was a fellow of Italian parentage from San Francisco, possessing a countenance as serene and unreadable as a wooden cigar store Indian, a pair of legs that could cover an acre of outfield grass in 3 strides, and a custom of swinging a piece of ash wood with a rhythm so beautiful, so perfectly balanced, that it would have made a professional ballet master burst into tears of professional envy. He did not run to theatrical display, he did not shout at the umpires, and he did not offer his opinions to the public on the state of the European emergency. He simply went out to his station every afternoon, adjusted his cap with a single, deliberate movement of his thumb, and set about the business of hitting a leather ball with a stick as though it were the sole purpose for which the solar system had been set in motion. On the 15th day of May, a date when the German Reich was busy tidying up its maps of Greece and Rudolf Hess was still explaining his liver remedies to his Scottish jailers, Joe stepped up to the plate and hit a single into left field against a pitcher from the Chicago White Sox. It was a perfectly ordinary transaction. It did not cause any bells to ring in the steeple or any national panics in the grandstand. It was merely a single line of small type in the morning papers, recorded under the standard audit of the local business. But as the week rolled on, and the weeks turned into months, that solitary hit began to look remarkably like the first shovel of dirt turned for the construction of a monument. For 56 consecutive games, stretching across 2 months of an uncommonly hot and dusty summer, Joe DiMaggio did not fail to hit that leather ball at least once every time he took his turn in the box. To appreciate the sheer, miraculous nature of the spectacle, one must understand that a baseball is a small, hard projectile delivered by a gentleman 60 feet away who has spent his entire youth perfecting the art of making that ball look like a turnip, move like a erratic hornet, and arrive at its destination with the velocity of an artillery shell. Furthermore, the pitcher is assisted in his designs by 8 other fellows who are scattered across the grass with large leather mittens for the express purpose of catching anything the hitter happens to touch and converting his finest intellectual efforts into a public disappointment. According to the laws of average, which are usually as rigid and unsympathetic as a New England schoolma'am, a man is supposed to have his bad days. He is supposed to suffer from an occasional fit of temporary blindness. He is supposed to step on a banana peel of bad luck. Or he is at least expected to encounter a pitcher who is having a momentary flirtation with the angels and cannot be hit at all. But as the summer of '41 deepened, Joe DiMaggio appeared to have entered into a private treaty with the laws of nature. By June, the streak had climbed past 30 games, and the public mind was beginning to undergo a highly interesting transformation. The great crowd of citizens, which had spent the spring looking at the headlines on the front page with a permanent frown, suddenly began to open the paper from the back. The primary question on the American continent was no longer whether the British Navy could protect the convoys or how far the German legions had advanced into the Russian wheat fields. The question that shook the nation every afternoon, from the logging camps of Oregon to the financial parlors of Wall Street, was, did Joe get his hit today? If the answer was yes, a collective sigh of satisfaction would go up from millions of throats, and the Republic felt it could go back to its supper with a clear conscience. If the answer was still delayed by the differences in the local clocks, people would gather outside the hardware stores to stare at the electronic tickers in the window, watching the little green sparks of light deliver the verdict from Boston, Cleveland, or Detroit with the breathless anxiety of a crowd waiting for the election of a pope. The pressure on the young man was of the sort that would have turned a standard politician into a shaking ruin before the third inning. Every pitcher in the league had sworn a holy oath to be the fellow who put an end to the miracle. They threw the ball at his toes. They threw it at his chin. They gave him nothing to look at but slow, curved balls that hovered over the plate like a disappointed bird. The grandstands were packed to the rafters with thousands of screaming partisans who looked upon every turn at bat as a matter of life or death, and the reporters followed him to his hotel, his restaurant, and his barber shop, watching his face to see if his eyelashes were trembling from the strain. But Joe moved through the fury of the summer with the grand, unbothered isolation of a planet navigating its orbit. He chewed his gum with rhythmic precision. He took his 3 practice swings before stepping into the box. And when the ball arrived, he delivered his splendid stick with a short, sharp crack that resounded through the summer air like a pistol shot in an empty church. The streak finally reached its accounting on the night of July 17th in a stadium in Cleveland under the glare of the new electric lanterns. Two clever young gentlemen named Smith and Bagby, assisted by a third base operator, who made two plays that appeared to violate the standard rules of gravity, managed to keep Joe from reaching first base for the first time since the middle of May. The miracle was over. The record stood at 56, a number that has remained carved into the permanent ledger of the sport ever since, looking as immovable and unapproachable as the giant faces on Mount Rushmore. When Joe walked off the field that night, he did not indulge in any dramatic displays of grief or philosophical speech-making to the crowd. He simply went to the locker room, took off his shoes, asked a teammate for a cigarette, and remarked that he was glad the business was settled so he could get some sleep. He had provided his country with 2 months of pure, unadulterated sunshine during the darkest season of the century. He had demonstrated to a distracted world that even when the great empires are entirely occupied with the heavy industrial business of mutual destruction, the human hand and the human eye can still come together to produce a daily miracle that has absolutely nothing to do with geography, politics, or the price of armor plate, leaving a memory of a splendid stick that would remain bright and unbroken long after the dust of 41 had settled over the ruins of the old world. Chapter 11. The Splendid Isolation of the .406 Average. If there is one thing that brings more comfort to the human soul than the contemplation of a miracle, it is the spectacle of a man who values his own self-respect a sight more than he values an entry in a museum catalog. History is uncommonly stingy with such individuals. As a general rule, when a person manages to climb up onto a high pedestal of public renown, his primary concern is to look around for a comfortable cushion, a set of strong ropes, and a couple of stout assistants to ensure he doesn't tumble off the monument before the photographer has finished his business. But the year of our Lord 1941, which had already witnessed Joe DiMaggio's grand summer trot through the record books, was about to conclude its athletic auditing with an exhibition of pure, unadulterated grit that would have done credit to a direct descendant of the ancient prophets. The theater for this particular manifestation of the American character was the city of Boston, and the protagonist was a 23-year-old outfielder for the Red Sox named Theodore Samuel Williams, though the public, with its characteristic fondness for brevity and descriptive labels, knew him simply as the Splendid Splinter. Now, Ted Williams was not what you would call a diplomat. He was a creature constructed entirely of long bones, wire-taut sinews, and a temper that could go from a dead calm to a purple, smoky fury in the time it takes a man to drop a nickel into a turnstile. He did not look upon the sporting public or the gentlemen of the printing press as his natural friends. He looked upon them as a collection of suspicious characters who spent their afternoons trying to distract him from his solitary sacred mission in life, which was to become the finest hitter who ever stood in a pair of spiked shoes. He possessed an eye so uncommonly sharp that his colleagues swore he could see the individual stitches rotating on a ball as it arrived at 80 miles an hour, and he practiced his swing with a devotion that bordered on the fanatical, standing before the mirror in his hotel room until midnight, whispering to himself about the position of his wrists and the angle of his chin. By the final week of September, while the German legions were completing their circle around Kiev and Uncle Sam's hardware store was turning out machine guns by the mile, Ted Williams had climbed to an altitude that made the rest of the league look like small children playing in a ditch. His batting average stood at precisely .399 and a fraction. To the average citizen, who was used to seeing a respectable hitter conclude his summer with an average of .300 or thereabouts, this figure was a matter for national astonishment. No human creature had managed to finish a season with an average of .400 since a gentleman named George Sessler had performed the feat nearly 20 years prior. It was the absolute Mount Everest of the sport, a peak so high and so cold that most players preferred to look at it through a telescope from the safety of the valley rather than attempt the ascent. According to the mathematical clerks who managed the ledgers of the game, if you carried Ted's fraction out to the third decimal place, it rounded off to .400 on the nose. On the final Saturday of the season, the manager of the Boston team, possessing the cautious, protective instincts of a mother hen, came to Williams with an uncommonly attractive proposition. The Red Sox had a doubleheader scheduled for the next day against the Philadelphia Athletics, a pair of games that had absolutely nothing to do with the league standings, the championship having already been secured by the New York Yankees. "Ted," said the manager in essence, "you are currently sitting on top of the world. If you sit on the bench tomorrow and look at the sunshine, your average will remain unhurt. The newspapers will declare you a miracle of modern history, and your name will be carved into the stone ledger of the sport as a genuine 400 hitter. You have nothing to gain by playing, and you have everything to lose if a crooked pitch or a bad bounce should drop you down a nickel into the high 300s. It was an excellent piece of advice. It was precisely the sort of cautious, middle-aged logic that keeps a man from investing his silver in a gold mine or climbing a tree to see what is inside a hornet's nest. But Ted Williams looked at the manager with that long, fierce, hawkish countenance that always made an umpire think twice before calling a strike, and he spit upon the dugout floor. "If I can't hit 400 by playing the game," said the splendid Splinter, "I don't deserve to have it written down in the book at all. Put my name on the card for both ends of the doubleheader." That evening, unable to sit still in his room under the weight of the national expectation, Ted went for a long, solitary walk through the streets of Philadelphia. He walked for miles through the dark, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, nodding to the occasional newsboy who recognized his lean silhouette, and looking up at the smoky sky as if he were trying to find out what the angels had decided about his tomorrow. The next morning, the 28th day of September, a cold gray wind was blowing across Shibe Park, a dreary old brick arena that had seen its finest days back in the time of President Taft. The crowd was small, mostly local citizens who had come out with their overcoats and blankets to see if they could witness a public suicide or a historic coronation. When Ted stepped into the box for his first turn at bat, the umpire, a veteran of 20 years on the lines named William McGowan, stepped out from behind the plate. He walked up to the young man, pretended to dust off the rubber with his whisk broom, and looked up through his mask. "Ted," whispered the umpire, "to hit 400, you've got to be a real man. Good luck to you." The Philadelphia pitcher, a young fellow named Dick Fowler, who had no intention of entering history as a charitable donor, delivered a fast, heavy ball that hovered over the outside corner. Williams did not hesitate. He delivered his long whiplash swing with a velocity that made the wire stays on the grandstand hum, and the ball tore through the infield like a panicked rabbit, landing in center field for a clean, undisputed single. The .400 barrier had been breached not by a mathematical rounding of the fractions, but by the clean weight of an honest hit. But Ted was not finished with his auditing. In the course of that long, cold afternoon, While the rest of the players were shivering in their sweaters and wishing for the end of the season, the splendid Splinter took his turn in the box 8 times across the 2 games. He did not hit like a man who was trying to protect a fragile piece of porcelain. He hit like a fellow who had been given a contract to reduce the supply of leather balls in the state of Pennsylvania. He hit another single that rattled the boards in right field. He hit a thunderous double that bounced off the iron wall in center. And he launched a home run that cleared the distant fence entirely and landed in the middle of a neighborhood street, causing a local dog to bark with astonishment. By the time the final out was recorded and the small crowd rose to cheer him through the twilight, Ted Williams had collected 6 hits in 8 tries. He had not merely preserved his record, he had expanded it, deepened it, and left it sitting at an altitude of .406. It was an exhibition of magnificent, uncalculating audacity that left the country store philosophers thoroughly out of breath. He had risked the grandest prize of his life on a pair of meaningless ball games, simply because his frontier sense of honor wouldn't allow him to slide into a monument through the back door. When the ledger of 1941 was finally closed for the winter, and the young men of the nation began to trade their baseball caps for the heavy tin hats of Uncle Sam's regular service, that .406 average remained bright and solitary against the gathering frost. It stood as a permanent proof that even in a season dominated by the cold mathematics of industrialized destruction, the individual human creature can still rise up and achieve a perfect, unbroken triumph, provided he has a sharp eye, a permanent disregard for the advice of the cautious, and a splendid stick that he is willing to swing until the sun goes down behind the bleachers. Chapter 12. The Lasso of Truth and the Amazonian Debut. It has been the constant labor of the human philosopher, ever since the first unprincipled politician discovered that he could improve his domestic situation by telling a lie, to invent some species of machinery that will force a man to speak the plain, unvarnished truth. We have tried the rack, we have tried the thumbscrew, we have tried the solemn oath administered over a large family Bible, and we have tried the threat of a permanent vacation in a country where the climate is uncomfortably warm and the firewood is free. Yet, all these expensive expedients have proved to be spectacular failures when confronted by a determined practitioner of the political arts, who can slide through a legal loophole with the grease-lighted ease of an eel navigating a bucket of lard. In the late autumn of the year of our Lord 1941, however, a gentleman of uncommonly varied intellectual parts decided that if science and theology had failed to secure an honest statement from the human creature, it was time to turn the business over to the writers of the 5-cent comic papers. The gentleman's name was Dr. William Moulton Marston. Now, the doctor was not the sort of person you would expect to find hanging around the local newsstand with his pocket stuffed with picture books. He was a Harvard scholar, a psychologist of formidable renown, and the inventor of a certain electronic apparatus that measured a man's blood pressure for the express purpose of finding out if he was being entirely straightforward about where he spent his Thursday evenings. But after spending several years watching respectable citizens tell the most magnificent untruths while hooked up to his machinery, the doctor arrived at a conclusion that would have done credit to a direct descendant of the ancient romancers. He decided that the world was growing entirely too loud, too heavy, and too masculine for its own health, and that what civilization required to save its skin from the global circus was a brand new species of savior, preferably a lady who came from a country where there were no men at all to confuse the plumbing, and who was equipped with an untearable gold rope that could make a prime minister tell the truth even when his job depended on a falsehood. The result of this psychological calculation was a fictional character named Wonder Woman, who made her spectacular debut in the pages of All-Star Comics in the closing weeks of 1941. To appreciate the sheer whimsical charm of this event, one must understand that the American comic paper in 41 was an establishment run almost entirely by very young men who had spent their youth reading about large iron-muscled gentlemen in blue tights who spent their afternoons jumping over barns and tossing locomotives at the neighbors. There was a standard formula to the trade. If a rascal appeared on the landscape, the hero did not argue with his philosophy. He simply hit him in the jaw with a fist the size of a 5-pound cabbage until the fellow saw the error of his ways and retired from the business. But Dr. Marston, writing under the pseudonym of Charles Moulton, introduced a radical variation into the Manual of Public Salvation. He created a heroine who was a princess of the Amazons, a lady named Diana, who lived on a sun-drenched sanctuary called Paradise Island, where the residents spent their time running races in short skirts, reading ancient Greek poetry, and remaining entirely ignorant of the price of pork or the state of the European geography. But when an American aviator happened to drop out of the clouds into their backyard, bringing news that the outer world was being systematically reduced to a pile of cinders by a gang of military lunatics, the princess took off her royal trimmings, put on a remarkably colorful uniform decorated with stars and eagles, and sailed away to America to see if she could introduce some sanity to the landscape. She did not arrive unprovided with tools. She brought with her a pair of silver bracelets that could deflect an artillery shell with a clatter like a boiler factory on a Monday morning, and she possessed a golden lariat that was forged from the very girdle of the goddess of beauty. Now, this was no ordinary length of old hemp from the hardware store. It was the Lasso of Truth. If Wonder Woman managed to loop this golden string around a spy, a profiteer, or a gentleman from the State Department, the victim would immediately go into a state of profound emotional transparency. His tongue would completely escape from his control, his knees would begin to shake, and he would proceed to reveal his most intimate financial secrets, his real opinion of his mother-in-law, and his secret plans to alter the local tax ledger, with a frantic velocity that suggested his mouth had been greased for the occasion. It was a magnificent piece of pure fantasy, and it arrived precisely at the hour when the real world was entirely occupied with a species of untruthfulness that was being carried on by some of the most prominent governors on the planet. In Washington, a pair of polite Japanese envoys were daily spending their afternoons discussing peace with the Secretary of State, using language that was as sweet and smooth as maple syrup, while their own navy was quietly moving across the northern mists with enough gunpowder to blow up the state of Hawaii. In Berlin, the official radio was daily announcing that every victory was a triumph of the spirit and every retreat was merely a clever way of luring the enemy into a trap. And in Moscow, the press lords were busy writing essays to prove that they had never really liked Herr Hitler anyway, even when they were dividing the Polish property with him 2 summers before. To look out upon this global exhibition of high-toned humbuggery, and then to open a 5-cent paper and see a handsome lady using a gold rope to force a villain to admit his real name and purpose, was a medicine that the American public took to its breast with an immense sigh of satisfaction. The isolationists, of course, looked upon this new literature with their usual solemn disapproval. They wondered why the youth of the nation should spend their nickels reading about an Amazonian princess who flew through the clouds in an invisible airplane, when they should have been studying the price of wheat or learning how to clean a rifle for the upcoming emergency. They suggested that the comic paper was a dangerous distraction from the serious business of life. But the average citizen, possessing that characteristic American fondness for the eccentric and the spectacular, knew a good thing when he saw it. Within a few weeks of her debut, Wonder Woman was selling more papers than any three of the traditional iron-muscled heroes combined. There was something uncommonly comforting about the notion that while the great smoke-belching empires were entirely occupied with the heavy industrial business of building bigger machines to drop heavier cylinders of TNT through their neighbors' roofs, a Harvard psychologist and a New York printer could create a heroine whose primary weapon was not a bomb or a rapid-fire gun, but a simple piece of gold rope that forced a man to look his neighbor in the eye and speak the honest truth until his ears turned red. It was a beautiful, whimsical addition to the ledger of 41. It provided a distracted republic with a permanent monument of hope, suggesting that whatever might happen to the geography of the old countries before the winter was out, the human race still possessed an unquenchable enthusiasm for the radical doctrine of fair play, an uncommon affection for an independent lady in a starry skirt, and a deep-seated suspicion that if we could only find a sufficiency of gold string, we might yet manage to scare the lies out of the world before the morning sun could rise over the anchorage. Chapter 13. The Diplomatic Dance of the Two Envoys. It has long been observed by those who make a study of the human animal in his collective or national state that when a gentleman intends to hit his neighbor with a particularly heavy piece of firewood, he will almost invariably spend the preceding 10 minutes bowing with immense elegance, offering his finest tobacco, and inquiring with the tenderest solicitude after the health of the neighbor's aunt. This is a practice known to the high trade as diplomacy, a science constructed upon the beautiful and old-established principle that the primary purpose of language is not to illuminate a fact, but to ensure it remains so thoroughly wrapped up in blankets that a sensible citizen cannot find it without a lantern and a pair of spectacles. In the late autumn of the year of our Lord 1941, this grand political quadrille was being carried on in the city of Washington with a degree of perfection that would have done credit to the finest theatrical managers in Paris or Vienna. The theater for the performance was the State Department, a large, gloomy stone palace where the air always smelled faintly of old ink, expensive cigars, and the collective sighs of generations of clerks who had spent their youth writing polite letters to unprincipled rascals. The chief protagonist on the American side of the ledger was Secretary Cordell Hull, a tall, lean, uncommonly solemn gentleman from the mountains of Tennessee who possessed the slow, deliberate speaking cadence of a country lawyer and a countenance that suggested he had just swallowed a pickle that didn't entirely agree with his constitution. Mr. Hull was a fellow who had spent his life under the impression that if you only treated a man with a reasonable degree of fair play, gave him an honest trade agreement for his silk and his tea, and spoke to him in the language of a Christian elder, the fellow would eventually lay down his club and behave himself like a respectable grocer in a quiet county. From the other side of the Grand Pacific Ditch came the two envoys of the Japanese Empire, Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura and Mr. Saburo Kurusu. Now, to look upon these two travelers as they arrived at the State Department every afternoon, with their silk top hats immaculate, their coats beautifully brushed, and their countenances fixed in expressions of the most profound and unalterable sweetness, was a spectacle that would have cheered up the heart of any philanthropist on the landscape. They did not look like men who belonged to a military firm that had spent the last 4 years systematically reducing the Chinese continent to a heap of smoky gravel. They looked like a pair of uncommonly wealthy silk merchants who had come to Washington for the sole purpose of purchasing a set of silver spoons for the president and admiring the autumn leaves along the Potomac. Every afternoon, around 2 o'clock, the two envoys would climb out of their sleek black motor car, offer a polite bow to the local policeman, and then ascend the stone steps to Mr. Hull's private parlor to engage in what the newspapers called the grand conversations. The terms of the argument were simple enough, provided you could strip away the 3 miles of legal tape that the clerks had wound around the business. Uncle Sam, having looked out from his hardware store and noticed that the Japanese military machine was quietly moving into the southern neighborhoods of Asia, with an eye toward acquiring the oil wells of the Dutch and the rubber plantations of the British, had suddenly tightened his purse strings. He had stopped selling them American petroleum. He had frozen their money in the New York banks. And he had informed them with great legal precision that if they wished to go back to their old position on the books, they must first take their boots off the Chinese lawn and promise to stop shaking hands with the Berlin firm of Herr Hitler. To the Japanese directors in Tokyo, whose fondness for an expansive map was quite as robust as Germany's, this American attitude was a species of intolerable impertinence. They felt that Uncle Sam had no more right to dictate the geography of the Orient than they had to tell the governor of Missouri how to manage the county court. But because their great naval clock was ticking loud and heavy in the dark, and their aircraft carriers required several weeks of quiet steaming through the northern mists to reach their proper stations for the winter's work, they instructed their two envoys in Washington to keep the conversation going with the velocity of a spinning top. What followed was a master class in the art of polite procrastination. The two envoys would sit in Mr. Hull's deep leather chairs, drink his ice water, and present him with long sheets of official paper that contained some of the most beautiful, high-toned prose ever produced by a typewriter. They spoke of the eternal peace of the great ocean. They wrote of their holy desire for harmonious accommodation, and they suggested that if Uncle Sam would only open up his oil tanks again and look the other way for 10 minutes, while they settled the business in Asia, the two nations would live together in a state of perfect, industrialized love until the stars grew cold. Mr. Hull would take these documents, adjust his spectacles with an uncommon degree of deliberation, and read through the text with his slow Tennessee drawl. He would point out that while the language was as sweet as clover honey, it didn't seem to contain any promise to remove those 300,000 Japanese soldiers who were currently parading through the neighborhoods of Indochina. Now, boys, Hull would say, in essence, this is all very fine and handsome, but a man cannot reasonably claim he is looking for a quiet walk in the garden when he is carrying a 3-pound brick in his pocket and looking at his neighbor's greenhouse. Kurusu and Nomura would immediately rise, bow from the waist with a symmetry that was beautiful to behold, and declare that the brick was merely a legal fiction, a temporary piece of ballast designed for nothing more dangerous than keeping their trousers straight in a high wind. Then they would offer another sheet of paper, introduce 3 new legal definitions that didn't mean anything at all, and suggest that they all meet again on Tuesday afternoon to see if the weather had cleared. It was a magnificent performance. It was carried on through October, through November, and into the first week of December, with a regularity that completely deceived the country store philosophers in the East. The average American citizen, watching the two envoys smile for the photographers on the steps of the Capitol every afternoon, felt a comfortable certainty that as long as the fellows were still bowing and talking, the guns would have to stay in their cases. But while the two diplomats were performing their elegant waltz in the parlor of the State Department, their hands filled with peace proposals and their mouths filled with molasses. The great iron fingers of their government were quietly turning a very different page in the book. Far out in the lonely deserts of the North Pacific, entirely out of reach of the commercial telegraphs and the eyes of passing steamers, a magnificent fleet of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and dozens of torpedo planes, was quietly moving through the gray mists with the silence of a pack of wolves walking across a carpet. They were navigating under a strict rule of absolute wireless silence, their electronic keys locked up in wooden boxes and their funnels baffled to keep from dropping a single spark of charcoal into the dark. They were moving toward an anchorage called Pearl Harbor, and they carried in their holds enough high-velocity TNT to reduce the ancient illusion of American isolation to a pile of scrap iron before the month was out. The two envoys knew perfectly well that the fleet was on the water. They knew that the great clock had been wound up to the final notch. And yet they returned to Mr. Hull's room on the afternoon of December 5th to offer another turn through the grand diplomatic dance, presenting a fresh note about the beauty of international trade and inquiring with the old, unalterable sweetness after the progress of the President's health. It was the most transparent piece of high-toned humbuggery ever practiced by a civilized state upon a trusting neighbor. It proved to all the world that when the ledger of human governance is being kept by the fellows with the large navies, a signed peace proposal is frequently nothing more than a very handsome, very expensive piece of wrapping paper, designed for the express purpose of keeping the neighbor's eyes fixed on the front gate while the family with the clubs is quietly climbing over the back fence in the dark. Chapter 14. The December Sun. Over the Hawaiian Anchorage. If there is one luxury that the American human values above all other dispensations of Providence, it is the undisputed right to be thoroughly, grandly, and systematically lazy on a Sunday morning. It is a secular Sabbath designed for the express purpose of allowing a man to sit on his porch in his shirt sleeves, read the local sporting supplement, scratch his dog behind the ears, and declare that the rest of the planet may go to the devil in its own way, so long as it does not disturb its breakfast. In the early days of December, in the year of our Lord 1941, this grand national posture of relaxation had reached its absolute pinnacle out in the territory of Hawaii. The island of Oahu was, to be fair, a piece of geography that appeared to have been constructed by the Creator during an uncommonly soft and charitable frame of mind. It was an estate filled with pineapple fields, flowering bushes, and a sea that was the color of a peacock's neck, where the wind blew with a warmth that made a man feel as though he had been wrapped up in a flannel blanket that had been lightly scented with vanilla. Down at the southern edge of this paradise lay Pearl Harbor, a majestic, land-locked anchorage where Uncle Sam kept the primary knuckles of his Pacific fleet parked in long, tidy rows, like a collection of massive iron barns sitting in a quiet mill pond. On the morning of December 7th, the sun arose over this establishment with a serenity that would have done credit to a church painting. The great battleships, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the Nevada, the California, lay floating in the still water, their flags fluttering in the early breeze and their clean wooden decks smelling of fresh scrub water and turpentine. The crews were largely occupied with the standard business of the morning, which consisted of looking through the Sears Roebuck catalog, writing letters to their girls in Missouri, or waiting for the ship's band to assemble on the quarterdeck to play the Star-Spangled Banner for the morning colors. A few miles away, at the military airfields, the American flying machines were parked wingtip to wingtip on the grass, arranged with a beautiful geometric regularity that made them look like a display of children's toys in a shop window. The local commanders, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, had spent the preceding week taking every precaution known to the manual to protect their property from the hazards of the local population. They had locked up the ammunition in iron boxes to keep it from being stolen by unauthorized characters. They had parked the airplanes in the middle of the fields to ensure a local vegetable clerk couldn't sneak up and scratch the paint with a pocket knife. And they had gone to bed with the comfortable certainty that since the two Japanese envoys in Washington were still bowing to Secretary Hull every afternoon, the Pacific Ocean was as safe for a Sunday picnic as a Baptist campground in Ohio. It was a beautiful, unbroken illusion of security, a posture of defense that suffered from the solitary, fatal defect of assuming that the burglar would naturally ring the front doorbell before attempting to enter the premises. At precisely 3 minutes before 8 o'clock, the silence of the morning was systematically demolished by a racket that made the local volcanoes look like small children playing with firecrackers. Out of the white clouds that drifted over the Koolau Mountains, there emerged a cloud of flying hornets that did not bear the familiar red, white, and blue targets of Uncle Sam's regular service. These were the torpedo planes and dive bombers of the Japanese Imperial Navy, numbering nearly 200 in the first installment, and they bore upon their wings a large, solid red circle that looked, to the startled eyes of the lookouts, like a sudden eruption of angry blood against the blue sky. They came down through the valleys with a velocity that made the palm trees bend over like grass, their engines roaring like 1,000 circular saws hitting an unyielding knot in an oak plank. Before the ordinary American sailor could even find his boots or conclude that the noise was something more serious than a lively practice drill by the Army, the first 10 fish were in the water, their tracks white and sharp against the blue mirror of the anchorage. What followed in the course of the next 2 hours was a spectacle of destructive industry that completely unseated all the established maxims of maritime history. The great Iron Mountains, those ancient multi-million-dollar battleships that had spent 20 years representing the majestic unapproachability of the American Republic, were caught entirely in their nightshirts. The Oklahoma was struck by a sufficiency of torpedoes within the first 3 minutes, rolling over in the mud like a great wounded whale and leaving her crew to climb up onto her slippery bottom to escape the rush of the water. The Arizona, a magnificent floating fortress that carried 1,000 young men in her belly, was struck in her forward powder house by a heavy, armor-piercing cylinder dropped from 10,000 feet. There was a flash that turned the tropical morning into a white furnace, a roar that shook the very coral reefs beneath the island, and the grand old pride of the Navy simply broke in two and sank to the bottom in a single, greasy cloud of suffocating smoke. The scene on the airfields was equally devoid of any traditional military romance. The American pilots, their hearts filled with a sudden purple fury, ran out onto the grass in their underwear and slippers, trying to find a machine that hadn't already been reduced to a heap of burning canvas and melted aluminum by the roaming Japanese gunners. A few managed to get into the air with their machine guns, but for the most part, the great geometric display of Uncle Sam's flying hardware was systematically converted into a 2-mile line of smoking bonfires before the mechanics could even find the keys to the ammunition lockers. Yet, through the middle of this smoky chaos, the character of the ordinary American human underwent a transformation that completely escaped the calculations of the Tokyo strategists. The Japanese directors had assumed that an unprovided, luxury-loving people, when subjected to a sudden thunderous exhibition of industrialized terror, would naturally fall into a state of profound panic, lose their place in the manual, and spend their morning running for the timberline. But they discovered that when you hit a free citizen on a Sunday morning while his shirt sleeves are rolled up, he does not look around for a white flag. He looks around for a heavy tool. Cooks left their ovens, scrambled through the smoke to the upper decks, and spent their morning firing machine guns at the clouds while wearing nothing but a white apron and a permanent grievance. Sailors swam through a river of burning oil to reach the guns of the Nevada as she cut her lines and tried to run for the open sea, her flags still flying and her anti-aircraft batteries spitting lead with a velocity that turned her upper works into a ring of fire. Even the ship's band of the Nevada, having started the Star-Spangled Banner just as the first bombs arrived, did not abandon their instruments or skip a single note of the text, concluding the melody with perfect professional decorum before dropping their horns to help carry the ammunition. By 10 o'clock, the Flying Hornets turned their noses back toward the north and vanished over the horizon, leaving behind a silence that was far more terrible than the noise that had preceded it. The great Pacific Fleet was a smoking ruin. 8 battleships were either sitting in the mud burning like old tar barrels, or turned upside down in the channel. 2,400 American boys had concluded their accounting with the planet, and the ancient comfortable illusion that 3,000 miles of salt water was a sufficient protection against the insanity of the old world had gone to the bottom of the anchorage along with the Arizona. The ledger of 41 had received its most thunderous, leaden entry. The news was flashed across the wires to a stunned continent, where it caused an immediate and total collapse of all the old political arguments. The isolationists dropped their whittling sticks, forgot their long speeches about the impassable ditch of the Atlantic, and quietly went down to the recruiting offices to see about the size of the tin hats. The Tokyo firm had achieved a magnificent historic victory on paper, but they had made the fatal, unscientific mistake of waking up a 70-million-pound giant by dropping a brick on his foot while he was having his Sunday nap. Before the smoke of Oahu had even cleared from the hills, the Japanese directors would find that the great hardware store was no longer interested in the business of supply. It was entirely occupied with the construction of a machine that would eventually return the compliment of December 7th on a scale that would leave the original performers without a house to shelter their philosophy. Chapter 15. The Unanimous Shout of the Capital. When the political governors of a great republic spend 5 or 6 years engaged in a chronic, unyielding argument over a matter of national philosophy, they accumulate a cargo of speech furniture that is uncommonly difficult to clear out of the parlor. They have their regular positions at the fence. They have their favorite adjectives, which have been polished by use until they shine like an old boot. And they possess a deep-seated conviction that if they should ever happen to agree with the fellow on the other side of the aisle, the laws of gravity would break down and the building would slide into the Potomac. But it is left to the peculiar chemistry of a sudden midnight surprise to show how quickly all this expensive intellectual property can be tossed into the furnace room. On the morning of December 8th, the day after the torpedo planes from the east had completed their destructive redecorating in the territory of Hawaii, the city of Washington awoke to a climate that was completely devoid of any traditional legislative fog. The clouds of political debate that had hung over the capital since the time of the Munich Agreement had vanished in a single afternoon, replaced by a cold, clear, uncommonly sharp atmosphere that made every stone face on the buildings look as though it had been freshly scrubbed by a bricklayer. The halls of Congress, which had spent the preceding autumn resounding with the furious, long-lunged denunciation of House Bill 1776 were packed to the very rafters with a crowd that had not come to hear an essay on the virtues of the cautious life. Shortly after noon, a sleek black motor car cleared the gates of the White House and made its way up the avenue toward the Capitol. Inside sat the President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his countenance fixed in an expression that was entirely different from the light-hearted, cigarette-holder-tilting jocularity he usually displayed for the photographers. He was a man who carried the weight of a shattered fleet on his shoulders and a permanent injury in his legs. But as he entered the grand chamber of the House of Representatives, leaning heavily on the arm of his son and the iron braces that supported his frame, the applause that rose from the floor was of the sort that shakes the plaster from the ceiling. It was not the polite, party-colored applause of a political convention. It was a single, thunderous roar that came from both sides of the center aisle, a sound that suggested the entire legislative branch had suddenly dropped its whittling sticks and was now standing shoulder to shoulder with a club in its hand. The President took his station at the rostrum, adjusted his spectacles with his customary deliberation, and opened a black loose-leaf binder that contained less than 500 words of text on a few sheets of heavy white paper. He did not indulge in any grandiloquent Old Testament rhetoric. He did not offer a 3-hour history of the geographical complications of the Orient. And he did not call for a committee to audit the accounts of the Hawaiian Department. He spoke with a voice that was as low, steady, and heavy as the stroke of an iron piston in a riverboat engine. "Yesterday," said the President, and the silence in the room was so thick you could have heard a clerk drop his pencil at the back of the gallery. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," fell into the ledger of human speech with the solid, immovable weight of a granite block dropped into a well. Franklin went on to describe, in less than 10 minutes of plain, unpolished prose, the masterclass in polite deception that had been performed by the two envoys at the State Department while their fleet was navigating the northern mists. He pointed out that while the Japanese government had been delivering sweet messages about the eternal peace of the great ocean, their flying hornets had already been systematically reducing Uncle Sam's property to a heap of smoking tin. "The people of the United States," the President concluded, his chin tilted at that fierce, defiant angle that always cheered up the country store philosophers, "have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." When he asked Congress for a declaration that a state of war had been officially initiated by the unprincipled conduct of the Tokyo directors, the response was a single, unanimous shout that resounded through the Capitol like a pistol shot in an empty barn. The Senate did not lose any time in the business. They retired to their chamber, turned off the electric fans, took a single look at the document, and passed the declaration by a vote of 82-0 in less than a quarter of an hour. The members did not even stop to make their customary speeches for the benefit of the newspapers at home, a performance of self-restraint that broke all local records since the founding of the District of Columbia. Down in the House of Representatives, the ledger was filled with almost equal velocity, though the proceedings were briefly punctuated by a circumstance that proved the Republic still possessed a few residents who preferred their private principles to the national mood. When the roll was called for the final accounting, 388 gentlemen rose to shout their agreement with the President's request. But when the clerk called the name of Miss Jeanette Rankin, a lady from the state of Montana who had spent her life under the holy conviction that war was a species of unchristian madness that no civilized community should ever invite to its yard, the chamber experienced a momentary hitch in its rhythm. Miss Rankin had been one of the select company who voted against entering the European scrap back in 17, and she had no intention of changing her ledger simply because the scenery had moved to the Pacific. "As a woman," she said, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of 400 pairs of masculine eyes staring at her from the benches, "I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." It was a magnificent piece of pure, uncalculating stubbornness. The rest of the members tried to convince her to change her mind, or at least to sit out the vote in the cloakroom, so the record could look perfectly symmetrical in the newspapers, but she refused to budge an inch from her fence. She voted no, thereby committing the state of Montana to a solitary posture of non-combatancy, and then she was forced to retire to a phone booth under the escort of the Capitol Police to escape the crowd of furious citizens who wished to offer her some unpolished advice on the finer points of patriotism. But the single dissenting voice could no more check the velocity of the national movement than a chip of pine wood could check the progress of the Mississippi River during the spring floods. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the document was signed, the ink was dry, and the full weight of Main Street was officially committed to the global circus. The great republic had discovered that while it had spent 20 years attempting to live behind an ocean ditch and a legal wall, it possessed an infinite, unquenchable enthusiasm for a proper fight once the neighbors had gone to the trouble of breaking the front windows. The news was received across the country with a quiet, business-like determination that completely unseated the calculations of the Axis planners. There were no grand parades with brass bands. There were no theatrical displays of flag-waving in the streets, and there was very little shouting by the crowd. The young men of the nation simply put on their hats, walked down to the post office, and stood in long, silent lines that stretched around the block, waiting to exchange their civilian overalls for the heavy gray wool of the regular service, ready to demonstrate to all the world that when you wake up Uncle Sam by dropping a brick on his foot, he does not call for a lawyer. He simply turns the whole republic into a single, vast factory for the production of armor plate, and goes to work with his sleeves rolled up until the ledger is completely cleared of the debt. Chapter 16. The Sudden Evacuation of the Orient. When a great, self-satisfied empire has spent a century or two establishing its flag in a distant corner of the globe, it is apt to look upon its properties with the comfortable, unblinking serenity of a landlord who believes his lease was personally countersigned by the recording angel. The governors will build their wide white plaster villas. They will lay out their neat gravel tennis courts. They will put on their immaculate white linen trousers for the afternoon promenade, and they will look upon the local population with the mild, benevolent condescension of a deacon looking at a basket of charity turnips. They will state to all who care to listen that their presence is a permanent monument to civilization, and that they intend to remain right where they are until the mountains melt and the rivers run backward into the hills. But the closing weeks of the year of our Lord 1941 were about to demonstrate, with a suddenness that unseated the top hats of some of the finest families in Great Britain and the United States, that an empire built upon a foundation of white linen and excellent club manners is a remarkably fragile piece of architecture when the family next door decides to show up with a wagon load of heavy artillery and a total disregard for the rules of tennis. The theater for this grand leaden reversal was the wide expanse of the Orient, stretching from the rocky, crowded fortress of Hong Kong to the lonely, sun-baked sandbar of Wake Island, and down to the magnificent tropical jungles of Malaya. For generations, the British and American outposts in the Pacific had been managed under the comfortable doctrine of the local garrison style. This was a system of defense constructed upon the beautiful and old-established principle that the mere sight of an Anglo-Saxon countenance, when properly framed by a polished leather belt and a pith helmet, was sufficient to cause any impertinent neighbor to drop his club, apologize for his bad manners, and retire from the lawn with a polite bow. The defenses were organized primarily for the comfort of the residents. The guns were kept beautifully greased to ensure they didn't look untidy in the sunshine, and the local officers spent their evenings discussing the state of the fox hunting prospects in Leicestershire or the latest theatrical intelligence from New York, with a complete and tranquil certainty that the Japanese military machine was a clumsy, short-sighted affair that wouldn't dare disturb a gentleman while he was having his dinner. But on the morning of December 8th, which was, owing to the peculiar geometry of the local clocks, the very same morning that the torpedo planes were concluding their work at Pearl Harbor, the grand illusion was struck by a hurricane from the east. The Japanese directors did not content themselves with hitting Uncle Sam's hardware store in Hawaii. They launched a simultaneous, multi-headed excursion across the entire map of the Pacific, moving with a velocity and a destructive efficiency that completely paralyzed the faculties of the local governors. Consider the situation in Hong Kong, that majestic mountain of British commerce that had been perched on the coast of China for 100 years like an immovable stone bulldog. The local authorities had spent decades assuring the merchants in London that the colony was an impregnable fortress, entirely surrounded by deep water, and guarded by a collection of some of the finest regiments that ever wore the king's uniform. But when the Japanese infantry came down through the hills of the mainland, crawling through the scrub like a pack of lean wolves, and bringing their mountain guns on the backs of small, stubborn ponies, the grand defenses were revealed to be as hollow as a paper lantern. The water supply was captured in the first few days. The great silver-plated cocktail shakers at the Peninsula Hotel were put away in the cupboards, and the garrison discovered with a sudden blue-purple clarity that an impregnable fortress is an uncommonly uncomfortable place to inhabit when you have no water to drink, no airplanes to clear the sky, and an enemy who insists on firing heavy shells through your dining room windows from morning until night. On Christmas Day, after a brief and miserable argument in the dark, the governor put on his finest coat, walked out to the enemy's headquarters, and signed his name to a ledger of surrender that delivered the ancient pride of the empire into the hands of a Japanese general who didn't care a nickel for the traditions of the house. While this tragedy was being enacted on the coast of China, an even more spectacular piece of unscientific blacksmithing was taking place down in the jungles of Malaya. The British firm had spent several million pounds constructing a naval base at the island of Singapore, a place they affectionately called the Gibraltar of the East. They had equipped it with giant 15-inch guns that could fire a shell the size of a fat hog 20 miles out to sea for the express purpose of destroying any enemy fleet that should be so foolish as to steam up to the front gate. It was a magnificent display of heavy ironwork, but it suffered from the fatal intellectual defect of being completely incapable of looking behind itself. The great guns were fixed in their concrete beds to face the wide ocean, They could not be turned around to fire into the backyard, and it was precisely into the backyard, through 500 miles of thick, muddy, mosquito-infested jungle that the British authorities had declared to be entirely impassable to a civilized soldier, that the Japanese army chose to make its entrance. They did not bring any heavy supply wagons or long trains of artillery to clog the tracks. They arrived on bicycles. Thousands of lean, sun-baked Japanese infantrymen, wearing nothing more substantial than a pair of cotton shorts and a cloth cap, came pedaling down the muddy paths of Malaya with the silence and the velocity of an unprincipled collection of telegraph boys. If a tire went flat under the pressure of the gravel, they did not stop to patch the rubber. They simply peeled the tire off the wheel and rode on the iron rim, producing a clicking, rattling clatter through the jungle that the British scouts frequently mistook for the sound of tanks or machine guns, causing them to retire from their positions in a state of profound bewilderment. If they encountered a river where the bridge had been blown up by the retreating defenders, they did not wait for their engineers to build a wooden monument. They simply took off their shirts, waded into the water with their bicycles on their shoulders, and emerged on the other side with their gunpowder dry and their determination unimpaired. To assist this bicycle excursion, the British Admiralty had dispatched two of its finest capital ships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, vessels that had spent the preceding year guarding the Atlantic and carrying prime ministers through the fog. They were commanded by Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, a gentleman who possessed a lifetime of naval experience and a deep, immovable conviction that a modern battleship, when properly provided with armor plate and a sufficiency of British discipline, had nothing to fear from any number of flying contraptions made of wood and canvas. On the 10th day of December, out in the South China Sea, that old-fashioned theory was brought into direct collision with the mid-20th century. The two great castles of the deep were discovered by a cloud of Japanese torpedo planes that had come out from the land airfields. There were no British fighter planes to clear the air, the local Air Force having already been reduced to a collection of burning bonfires on the grass of the northern stations. For 2 hours, the Japanese pilots carried on their work with the quiet, methodical precision of a gang of iron workers assembling a boiler. They dropped their tin fish from every direction at once, striking the Prince of Wales in her delicate steering gear and opening the great sides of the Repulse to the rush of the water. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, both of the magnificent champions had rolled over and vanished into the warm green depths of the tropical sea, taking with them the brave old admiral, 800 young sailors, and the ancient, comfortable doctrine that the wooden-headed directors in London could maintain a global monopoly on the empire of the waves by simply showing the flag and relying on the memories of Lord Nelson. The news of this double liquidation struck the world country store philosophers with the force of a heavy timber falling through a glass roof. Winston Churchill later recorded that, in the course of the entire war, he never received a single shock that caused his knees to tremble with such a cold, sickening sensation of disaster. He realized, with the sudden clarity that comes to a man whose house has just been unroofed by a gale, that the entire Eastern Empire was now sitting out in the weather without a single umbrella to protect its philosophy. Even out on the lonely, microscopic sandbar of Wake Island, a miserable little patch of coral and scrub, where a few hundred American Marines and a crowd of civilian contractors were busy digging ditches, the local garrison style was undergoing a swifter and more leaden reversal than anything ever imagined by the authors of the Romantic histories. They were surrounded by a whole fleet of Japanese cruisers. They were bombed by the Flying Hornets every morning at breakfast, and they possessed nothing to shoot back with except a few old 5-inch guns salvaged from a scrap heap and 4 damaged airplanes that had to be held together with safety pins and the wire from old brooms. Yet, before they were finally overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the numbers, those stubborn Marines managed to sink a pair of Japanese destroyers, damage a cruiser, and send a message back to the Navy Department that would cheer up the heart of every whittler on the continent: send us more Japs. It was a magnificent piece of frontier impudence, but it could no more check the velocity of the disaster than a chip of pine wood could check a landslide. On the day before Christmas, the little island fell silent. The flag was pulled down from the pole, and the residents were escorted to the prison wagons to begin their long, cold audit of the winter. By the final week of December, the great Audit of 41 had reached a state of absolute blue-purple bankruptcy for the Western managers in the Orient. The white linen trousers were all packed away in the boxes. The tennis courts were overgrown with jungle weeds, and the ancient, comfortable illusion that the Eastern empires could be governed by the simple application of a high tone and a polished leather belt had gone to the bottom of the Pacific along with the grand battleships. The human race had discovered, through a series of swift and leaden reversals that left both London and Washington thoroughly out of breath, that when you are locked in a frantic, industrialized struggle with an unprincipled neighbor, you cannot settle the accounts by quoting the old laws of lease or pointing to your ancestors' pictures on the wall, leaving the great republics to face the new year with a clear understanding that if they ever intended to visit their old properties again, they would have to build a machine that was twice as heavy, twice as loud, and 5 times as destructive as the one that had just evicted them from the neighborhood. Chapter 17. The Unlocking of the Elemental Sovereign. If there is one thing that gives the human creature a more exalted opinion of his own intellect than the carving of a mountain or the construction of a 70-ton battleship, it is the quiet, backroom business of meddling with the invisible. We have a natural, deep-seated enthusiasm for peering through a glass lens at things that are too small to be seen, or poking a wire stick into mysteries that were designed by the Creator to be left entirely alone in the dark. If a thing is so small that 1,000,000 of them could dance on the point of a needle without crowding the orchestra, we immediately feel a holy call to capture one, split it open with an intellectual chisel, and see if we can find a way to make it do our heavy work for us. In the early months of the year of our Lord 1941, while the great smoke-belching nations were entirely occupied with the loud, expensive industry of moving 3 million men in boots across the landscape, a very different sort of auditing was carried on in a quiet laboratory at the University of California. The primary directors of this business were a collection of uncommonly pale young researchers, led by a gentleman named Dr. Glenn Seaborg. Now, these were not the sort of fellows you would expect to find parading down Main Street with a brass band or shouting from a balcony about the national destiny. They were gentlemen who wore ink-stained smocks, spent their afternoons arguing over things that didn't possess any smell, color, or weight to recommend them to the country store philosophers, and lived in a state of permanent, high-toned intimacy with the periodic table, an establishment they looked upon with more reverence than a bishop reserves for the ancient canons. They had spent the preceding winter playing a game of electronic billiards with a monstrous 80-ton iron ring called a cyclotron. This apparatus was designed for the express purpose of picking up an invisible bit of chemistry, whirling it around a track until it was traveling with a velocity that would make a lightning bolt look like a lazy farm horse, and then slamming it into a piece of unoffending metal to see what kind of a racket it would produce in the dark. In March of 1941, after several weeks of this unscientific blacksmithing, the researchers managed to isolate a brand new element that had never been seen by the human eye since the morning of creation. It was an invisible bit of chemistry that they decided to name plutonium, after the ancient Roman king of the underworld, a choice of vocabulary that suggested the doctors possessed a much sharper sense of irony than the public usually attributes to the scientific fraternity. To understand the exquisite, whimsical terror of this discovery, one must look upon the ledger of the natural world as it stood before the California boys, took a notion to alter the text. For millions of years, the heaviest, most complicated element known to the neighborhood was uranium, a substance that sat at the very end of the line like a fat old squire who had lived in the parish so long he felt he owned the road. It was an element that was already uncommonly twitchy and thin-skinned, given to a slow internal grumbling that would occasionally result in a bit of its own substance flying off into space without any prompting from the neighbors. But Dr. Seaborg and his colleagues were not satisfied with the squire's size. They decided to stuff another pair of electronic passengers into his coat pockets by force of artillery, creating a brand new sovereign that was completely unknown to the natural laws of geography. The amount of this new element they managed to collect in that first spring was not what you would call an avalanche of material wealth. It was a quantity so microscopic that it couldn't have been seen without a magnificent glass lens, and if a man had attempted to weigh it on a standard country grocery scale, the clerk would have told him he was wasting his time with a thimbleful of nothing at all. They kept it in a little glass vial that looked like it had been salvaged from a doll's medicine chest, and they handled it with a pair of long silver tweezers as though it were a drop of holy water from a miraculous well. But the intelligence that was contained in that microscopic speck of dust was of the sort that would make every crown on the planet feel remarkably loose on the owner's head. For the researchers discovered that this synthetic sovereign, this invisible child of the California cyclotron, possessed an internal character that was 5 times as volatile as anything ever found in the old mines of the earth. If you gathered a sufficient quantity of this material together in a single basket, a quantity that didn't need to be any larger than a respectable winter turnip, the individual pieces would begin to look at each other with an eye toward a mutual dissolution. They would reach a state of collective excitement that would result in a sudden, instantaneous transformation, unlocking a sheet of elemental fire that could reduce a whole township to a pile of gray ash in the space of a single heartbeat, and leaving a hole in the ground that would look like a private entrance to the underworld. It was a magnificent piece of pure chemistry, delivered into the ledger of 41 precisely at the hour when the human race was proving that it had very little business being trusted with anything more dangerous than a standard wooden spade. The official governors in Washington, when the secret report was brought to their parlors, did not rush to the newspapers to announce that the California boys had invented a new way to retire the planet from the solar system if it grew too weary of the residents. They took the news with that deep, blue-purple secrecy that always visits a politician when he discovers he has acquired a tool that can either save his skin or blow up his own greenhouse before the election. They opened a brand new page in the Great Continental tab, stamped it with a seal that contained 3 miles of legal warnings, and began to filter millions of dollars out to the Western laboratories under the pretense of purchasing an extra supply of Navy stationery and old copper wire. The isolationists in the East remained entirely ignorant of the transaction. They spent their autumn passing laws to ensure that no American boy should ever be exposed to the hazards of foreign geography, while a few miles away, in a quiet basement, a collection of young men with slide rules were quietly demonstrating that geography itself was about to become an optional luxury for the human family. The unlocking of the elemental sovereign proved to all the world that the true boundaries of human history are never quite settled by the generals with the high collars or the diplomats who perform their elegant waltzes in the State Department. It showed that while the great roaring empires are entirely occupied with the heavy industrial business of building bigger engines to drop heavier cylinders of TNT through their neighbors' roofs, the absolute master of the upcoming century was being quietly manufactured in a clean room out in California by a handful of ink-stained scholars who had managed to catch a star by the tail and bottle it in a doll's medicine vial. It was a final silent entry to be recorded in the Audit of 41, a monument of pure intellect that would sit in the dark of the continent for the remainder of the great struggle, waiting for the hour when humanity should grow so thoroughly exhausted by the old-fashioned methods of mutual destruction that it would gladly turn the keys of the planet over to an invisible piece of chemistry and trust its future sanity to the cold, unblinking forbearance of an element that had been invented by a committee of stonecutters who didn't even know its name when the spring had commenced. Chapter 18. The Grand Mobilization of the Shopkeepers. When a long-established, peace-loving nation that has spent 30 years perfecting the art of the comfortable life is suddenly required to turn its entire attention to the business of the blacksmith, the transformation is apt to produce a great deal of creaking in the public joints. The American Republic was, by all accounts, the most magnificent monument to the gospel of the shopkeeper ever erected on the scenery of the earth. It was a country where the primary intellectual energy of the population was devoted to the manufacturing of things that could make a man fat, keep his wife from ruining her hands in the washtub, or allow his daughters to ride to the church social in a vehicle that didn't require a horse to give it a sense of direction. But in the middle of December, in the year of our Lord 1941, Uncle Sam took a single look at his shattered fleet sitting in the Hawaiian mud, reached out his long arm, and turned off the civilian assembly lines with a single thunderous bang of his fist that shook every hardware store on the continent. The decree that went out from the offices in Washington was entirely free of any delicate middle-aged hesitation. It was announced to the public that henceforth, for the duration of the current global emergency, no more passenger automobiles, no more domestic refrigerators, no more electric washing machines, and no more nickel-plated radios would be manufactured for the use of the private citizen anywhere within the boundaries of the Republic. To the average whittler on the porch, whose mind had been trained to believe that the right to purchase a fresh six-cylinder sedan every 2 years was one of the primary clauses in the Declaration of Independence, this news was a species of psychological earthquake. For 30 years, the great automobile factories of Detroit had been the very cathedrals of the national prosperity. They were places where a mountain of iron ore could be fed into one end of a brick shed, and by the time the sun went down, a mile of beautiful, shiny carriages would emerge from the other end, smelling heavily of fresh varnish and leather, and equipped with enough chrome ornaments to decorate a respectably sized cathedral in Spain. The managers of these establishments had spent their lives under the impression that the highest purpose of human intellect was to make a car look 6 inches longer than the model built by the firm down the street. But by the order of the government, the chrome was scraped off the inventory, the varnish brushes were thrown into the corner, and the great directors of the trade were told to forget about the preferences of the Sunday drivers. Suddenly, the Chrysler Corporation, which had spent the autumn perfecting the upholstery on a handsome new carriage for the suburban market, found its floors cleared of all civilian machinery. The benches where the clerks used to assemble the delicate parts of a dashboard were torn out, replaced by massive 4-ton iron anvils designed for the express purpose of beating out the armor plate for 28-ton tanks named General Grant. The engineers, who had spent their youth discussing the smoothest way to spring a seat to keep a lady from bouncing when she hit a hole in the road, were now entirely occupied with the problem of how to make a treads and roller system that could walk right through a brick wall or over a ditch without dropping a single bolt into the mud. The makers of sewing machines, too, experienced a sudden and unscientific redecoration of their premises. They stopped assembling those small, silver-plated needles that had spent 50 years mending the trousers of the Republic. They turned their talents instead to the production of rapid-fire guns that could spit lead through a copper pipe at the rate of 600 rounds a minute. The manufacturers of women's corsets, establishments that had previously been regarded as the very bulwarks of domestic decorum, were told that the nation had very little interest in the modification of the feminine silhouette for the winter. They were handed a contract for the production of parachutes, turning their experience with canvas, wire stays, and complicated buckles to the creation of silk umbrellas designed to drop a 300-pound infantryman safely out of the clouds into a neighbor's cabbage patch. Even the factories that turned out toy trains for the Christmas trade were liquidated for the season, their delicate presses set to work stamping out the fuses for artillery shells with a regularity that suggested the children would have to content themselves with a whittled stick and an old hoop until the peace was settled. This was a grand mobilization of the shopkeepers on a scale that completely staggered the intellect of the old kingdoms across the water. The Berlin directors, whose fondness for a uniform had led them to believe that a nation cannot be dangerous unless every citizen has been taught to step off with his left foot at the sound of a whistle, looked upon this American transformation with the cold Christian disapproval of a professional horse trader looking at a mule that had been broken by an amateur. They pointed out that you cannot convert a peaceful salesman of insurance or an unpolished clerk from a grocery store into a proper blacksmith by simply handing him an apron and a heavy hammer. They suggested that the Republic would find its machinery too clumsy and its people too fond of their breakfast to maintain the pace of an industrialized struggle. But the German managers had entirely overlooked the peculiar, flexible genius of the American mechanic. This was a human creature who had spent his youth tinkering with the internal economy of a Model T Ford in the backyard, using nothing more substantial than a pair of rusty pliers, a length of fence wire, and a permanent suspicion of the manufacturer's manual. He did not require a sergeant to tell him how to turn a bolt or how to make a piece of old iron perform a service it hadn't been designed for. Within 3 months of the Pearl Harbor surprise, the noise that arose from the American manufacturing districts was of the sort that would have made the ancient emperors of Rome look for a cellar to hide in. The shipyards of California, under the direction of an ambitious builder named Henry Kaiser, began to assemble 10,000-ton cargo wagons called Liberty ships, with a velocity that suggested they were being turned out by a pastry cook. They did not use the traditional slow-moving methods of the old maritime carpenters. They didn't wait to drive 1,000,000 individual rivets into the hull while the vessel sat on the stays. They built the cabins, the decks, and the bows in separate pieces 3 miles away in the hills, brought them down to the water on the backs of giant flat cars, and welded them together with an electric torch in the space of a few days, producing a ship so fast that the lookouts on the Atlantic convoys swore they would see a keel laid down on a Monday morning and meet the completed vessel in mid-ocean by the following Friday afternoon. The avalanche of material wealth that began to pour out of these transformed shops was of a weight that completely unseated the old ledgers of commerce. It was a river of iron, rubber, and gunpowder that rolled toward the ports with the steady, unyielding progress of a glacier. Uncle Sam had closed his shop to the private customer, but he had opened a wholesale warehouse that had pledged its entire inventory to the liquidation of the global debt. The country had discovered that its true strength lay not in the size of its regular standing regiments or the antiquity of its military traditions, but in the magnificent, roaring, smokestack-belching industry of its ordinary mechanics, who had dropped their order books, pulled on their greasy canvas aprons, and were now busy demonstrating to all the world that when a nation of shopkeepers decides to go into the hardware business for keeps, it can turn out enough armor plate and rapid-fire hornets to bury the competition under a mountain of scrap iron before the winter has run its course. Chapter 19. The Frostbite of the Invading Engine. When a military director of expansive continental ambitions has spent his entire summer driving his iron beetles through his neighbor's wheat fields with the speed of a high-priced fire engine, he is uncommonly liable to fall into the comfortable delusion that he has entered into a private arrangement with the laws of nature. He looks upon his maps, notices that his columns have covered 500 miles of foreign real estate in less time than it takes a Missourian to break a stubborn mule to the plow, and decides that the local climate will naturally behave itself out of sheer respect for his uniforms. By the late autumn of the year of our Lord 1941, Herr Hitler's grand Prusso-Berlin enterprise had arrived within distinct sight of the steeples of Moscow. The advanced scouts of the German army could actually see the great golden domes of the Kremlin, blinking in the pale sunshine through their long glass lenses. The local generals, whose collars were uncommonly stiff with gold braid and whose monocles were polished to the final degree of professional arrogance, were already sending telegraphs back to the Home Office to inquire about the proper protocol for the upcoming victory parade, debating whether it would be more elegant to march the brass bands through the Red Square on a Tuesday morning or a Wednesday afternoon, and making sure the photographers had a sufficient supply of fresh film to record the triumph for the papers. It was a beautiful, symmetrical calculation. It suffered from the solitary, fatal defect of assuming that the calendar would stop turning its pages simply because the German Reich had reached the suburbs. For the great architect of the universe, when he laid out the immense, trackless backyard of the Russian continent, provided it with a regular winter visitor, who has never been known to show the slightest interest in the finer points of European statecraft. He is a commander who doesn't carry a sword, doesn't wear a decoration from the office staff, and possesses zero patience for any traveler who arrives in his territory without a sufficient supply of woolens and a thick pair of boots. The locals call him General Winter, and by the first week of December he had officially arrived on the scene to audit the books of the invading engine. Now, the German directors had spent 2 years perfecting the art of the blitzkrieg, a system of warfare constructed entirely upon the principle of the high-speed holiday. It required the roads to be dry, the machinery to move with the velocity of a panicked rabbit, and the soldiers to wear light, handsome summer tunics that looked uncommonly well in the promotional literature published in Berlin. The Grand Director had been so entirely certain the whole Russian structure would collapse into a pile of toothpicks before the leaves fell that he had strictly forbidden his quartermasters to burden the supply trains with any heavy winter overcoats, flannel underwear, or grease that could withstand a proper frost. He felt that such items were an unnecessary drag on the velocity of the enterprise. Consequently, when the thermometer outside the Moscow steeples suddenly dropped 30 degrees in a single night, creeping down to a depth that would make a brass thermometer look around for a blanket. The grand military machine was revealed to be about as well prepared for the climate as a convention of ballroom dancers caught in an Arctic gale. The first thing to go into a state of absolute blue-purple bankruptcy was the modern, delicate machinery of the Iron Beetles. The German engineers had spent 20 years building engines that were models of delicate, high-priced precision. But that precision had been designed for the sensible climates of France and Belgium. When the great frost of 41 laid its icy fingers upon the cylinders, the expensive lubricating oil, which had been manufactured with the utmost scientific care in the Essen laboratories, underwent an unscientific transformation. It turned into a thick gray tallow that had the consistency of institutional glue and the adhesive power of a permanent mortar. A driver would go out to his tank in the morning, crank the handle with a fury that threatened to pull his shoulder bones out of their sockets, and find that the great multi-ton iron monster was as cold, silent, and unyielding as a granite monument on a courthouse lawn. The delicate gears were frozen solid in their tracks. The rubber linings on the wheels cracked into small fragments like dry toast under the pressure of the ice. And the only way a crew could induce an engine to show a single spark of life was to build a bonfire directly underneath the fuel tank with a few logs of pine wood, a performance of pure frontier blacksmithing that occasionally resulted in the tank, the engine, and the crew all ascending to the clouds together in a spectacular shower of sparks and aviation fuel. Even the rapid-fire guns, which had spent the summer spitting lead through the neighborhood with the velocity of a circular saw, discovered that the frost lacked a proper respect for their manual. The firing pins would strike the frozen grease and snap off short like a piece of brittle candy, leaving the soldier to defend his position with nothing more substantial than an old iron pipe and his own unpolished vocabulary. But if the machinery was suffering from a lack of foresight, the human element of the firm was in a situation that would have moved the heart of a timber wolf to pity. The ordinary German soldier was still wearing the same cotton and wool trousers he had started out with back in June, which had been worn thin by 5 months of marching through the dust and sleeping in the ditches of the Ukraine. He had no boots, but the standard leather marching gear, shoes that had been fitted with iron nails in the soles for the express purpose of keeping his feet firm on a gravel road, but which now acted as a magnificent electronic apparatus for conducting the freezing cold of the Russian soil directly into his toes. Within a week, thousands of decorated heroes were walking through the snow with their feet wrapped in old sacks, their noses the color of an unprincipled beet, and their hands stuffed into their pockets to keep their fingers from dropping off into the drift like dry twigs from an old apple tree. While this frostbite was systematically reducing the efficiency of the invading engine, the local resident, the Stubborn Moujik, was undergoing an entirely different sort of transformation. Comrade Stalin, having discovered that General Winter had officially cleared his desk for action, brought a brand-new army out from the deep deserts of Siberia. These were regiments of men who had been raised in a climate where the ice didn't break up until July, and who looked upon a 30-below-zero gale as a highly pleasant indication that the summer humidity had finally passed away. They did not wear any tight, handsome tunics or iron-shod shoes designed for a parade in Paris. They arrived on the scene wearing immense 3-inch coats made of real sheepskin. They wore giant thick boots made of felted wool called valenki, which could keep a man's toes as warm as a couple of comfortable toast slices, even when he was sleeping in a snowdrift. And they navigated the gray hills on long wooden skis with the silence and the velocity of a pack of winter ghosts. On the morning of December 6th, Just 24 hours before the red targets were appearing over the Hawaiian anchorage, a gentleman named General Georgy Zhukov, a short, heavy-set Russian commander who possessed a countenance as flat and unyielding as a blacksmith's anvil, issued a short, sharp order to his Siberian legions. They did not advance with the beautiful mechanical rhythm of the Prussian manuals. They rose out of the white snowdrifts in the dark of night, their white camouflage capes making them completely invisible against the scenery, and they fell upon the freezing German columns with a fury that broke the ledger of 41 completely in two. Suddenly, the great invincible army that had spent 2 years clearing Europe of all competition discovered that it had lost its ability to move. They could not retreat, for their trucks were frozen solid in the mud. They could not advance, for their boots were full of ice and their fingers couldn't hold a rifle. And they were forced to stand their ground in the freezing wilderness, while the Siberian ski troops circled around their kitchens, cut off their supply trains, and treated them to a species of low-grade back-alley warfare that had never been sanctioned by any university in Berlin. By the final week of December, the grand advance upon the Moscow steeples had completely dissolved into the most miserable, frost-bitten retirement since the time of the first Napoleon. The roads were littered with hundreds of abandoned tanks, thousands of dead horses that had been frozen as stiff as iron lawn ornaments, and miles of expensive German hardware that had been left behind to be audited by the local crows. The great truant engine had run out of both gas and geography. It had proved to all the world that when you engage in the business of global conquest, you must eventually reckon with the ancient and immovable laws of the climate, and that a signed manifesto from a global reformer is a remarkably poor substitute for a thick woolen coat and an honest pair of boots, when General Winter takes it into his head to clear the yard of visitors before the spring has a chance to look at the bills. Chapter 20. The Audit of 41. When a reckless speculative merchant spends a 12-month embarking upon a series of uncommonly grand and hazardous transactions, buying up all the unprincipled properties in the neighborhood on credit, and shaking his fist at the local bailiff from his front window, there must inevitably come an hour when the sun goes down behind the courthouse. The clerks pull out their high stools, and the firm is required to face the cold, unchristian geometry of a final accounting. The human race, taken in its collective or global aspect, had spent the year of our Lord 1941 engaged in the most frantic, high-flying, and expensive piece of speculative madness ever recorded in the long and muddy ledger of civilization. By the final week of December, the great clock in the recording office was ticking loud and heavy in the dark, and the planet was brought face to face with an audit that completely unseated all the established maxims of the political philosophers. It was a ledger that had commenced with a single nation, Uncle Sam's comfortable, peace-loving republic, taking off its top hat, pulling on a canvas apron, and offering to open an infinite financial tab for the benefit of its neighbors under the name of a garden hose. It concluded with the entire human family, from the frozen steeples of Moscow to the tropical pineapple fields of Oahu, locked together in a single, roaring, industrialized wrestle to see who could most efficiently reduce the wealth of the globe to a mountain of gray cinder and smoking iron before the winter ran its course. To appreciate the sheer whimsical tragedy of the balance sheet, one must look upon the transformation that had overtaken the landscape in the space of 365 days. In January, the great empires were still conducting their scraps on a species of small-town retail system. John Bull was keeping his watch on his chalk cliffs. Herr Hitler was drawing his neat lines on his maps of Europe, and the ordinary citizen on the American continent was still perfectly free to spend his summer tracking the trajectory of a leather baseball across the grass, or arguing over a new moving picture about a newspaper king who died lonely because he had forgotten the name of his favorite childhood sled. The war was treated as a large, troublesome nuisance that belonged primarily to the old countries across the water, a piece of chronic insanity that could be effectively kept out of the New World's yard by the simple application of an ocean ditch and a few laws designed to keep the native boys from getting their coats dusty. But by December, the retail system had been permanently liquidated. The hardware store had been struck by a lightning bolt from the east on a Sunday morning, while its shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the world had discovered that when you are dealing with a gang of incendiary lunatics, you cannot maintain a partial interest in the fire next door. The ledger revealed that the boundaries of human history had completely broken loose from their ancient foundations. In the Orient, the great landlords who had spent a century establishing their flag under the protection of excellent club manners and white linen trousers were systematically evicted from their properties in the space of 3 weeks by a collection of lean Japanese infantrymen who didn't care a nickel for the traditions of the house and traveled through the impassable jungles on iron bicycle rims. The ancient pride of the British Admiralty, vessels that had spent 20 years representing the majestic unapproachability of the empire, lay floating at the bottom of a tropical sea, sent there by a cloud of flying hornets that had demonstrated that a modern battleship is nothing but a very expensive iron coffin if it doesn't possess a single friend in the clouds to clear the air. In the West, the grandest betrayed partnership in the history of back-alley geometry had reached its cold and frozen accounting. Herr Hitler had decisioned that his solemn treaty with Comrade Stalin was looking a bit dusty, and he had launched 3 million of his finest soldiers into the trackless backyard of the Russian continent, under the impression that the whole structure would collapse into a pile of toothpicks if he only kicked in the front door. But he had forgotten to consult the local climate. He had sent his iron beetles out into the wilderness in their summer uniforms, and by December, General Winter had taken charge of the auditing branch, converting the Grand Prussian advance into a miserable, frost-bitten retirement, where the engines had to be thawed out with a bonfire, and the decorated heroes were walking through the drifts with their feet wrapped in old sacks. Through it all, the true master of the upcoming century had been quietly manufactured in a clean basement out in California, where a committee of ink-stained researchers with slide rules had isolated an invisible bit of synthetic chemistry called plutonium. It was a sovereign that didn't possess any color, smell, or weight to recommend it to the country store philosophers, but it carried in its pockets the secret key to the solar system, a power so volatile that if humanity did not eventually find a sufficiency of common honesty to manage its affairs, this invisible child of the cyclotron stood perfectly ready to settle the argument by erasing the residents from the map entirely. The human race had reached a situation where its mechanical ingenuity had completely outrun its moral capacity. Man had proved himself to be the only animal on the landscape that will spend his spring passing laws to ensure that every child has a hot lunch, his summer predicting the behavior of a baseball with the passion of a prophet, his autumn writing a noble charter to guarantee freedom for all on a piece of Navy stationery, and his winter inventing a machine to drop a 500-pound cylinder of TNT through the roof of his neighbor's kitchen. As the final hours of 41 slipped away into the gray mist of the new year, the great republic stood looking out upon a landscape that had been entirely cleared of its old illusions. Uncle Sam had turned off his civilian assembly lines, locked up his showrooms, and was busy converting every garage, sewing machine factory, and toy shop in the country into a single, vast furnace for the production of armor plate. The citizens had dropped their order books, forgotten their long speeches about the security of the Atlantic, and were standing in long, silent lines outside the post offices, ready to exchange their overalls for the heavy tin hats of the regular service. The accounts were not settled. They were merely commenced on a scale that staggered the imagination of the traditional accountants. The ledger of 41 was closed with a heavy, leaden stroke of the pen, signed by a generation of young men who were preparing to cross two oceans with a permanent grievance and an infinite quantity of rapid-fire hardware, and leaving the planet to navigate its dark orbit into the winter, with a clear understanding that before the true audit of the century could be concluded, the human family would have to demonstrate whether it possessed enough internal sanity to survive the magnificent and terrible perfection of its own tools, or whether it was destined to leave the planet a cold, silent monument of iron scrap to be contemplated by some interested astronomer on the moon as a warning against the hazards of the unchecked intellect. The end. I'll see you in 1942.